Screen capture is rolling, microphone is rolling, camera's rolling. I've got my coffee, so we're good to go. Hey, what's up, everyone? This is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to my 300,000 subscriber Q&A special. I've gotten about 50 questions from my previous video that I posted about this, and I plan on answering just about all of those questions, all of the ones that are relevant questions that I can actually answer. Before I get into that, I want to, first and foremost, thank you guys for all of your continued support over these past 11 years. It has been an absolutely life-changing and life-altering experience to be able to teach in a format over YouTube and actually make an income from it. So it's been, like I said, a completely life-changing experience for the better. You know, it's been a positive thing in my life, and I never really intended for it to be what it is now. I'm very thankful that it is, but when I started the channel 11 years ago, I was an adjunct professor at a local arts college teaching Logic and Pro Tools and audio production and piano and music theory. These are the types of classes I was teaching, and some of the topics were kind of condensed, you know, or at least the format of these courses were condensed. They were like in 10 or 5-week, modules. So some of the topics were easy to forget. So I thought to myself, well, why not just make some little tutorials and post them to YouTube as a supplement for my ground classes? And that's really how the channel got started. And while some of my early content was pretty cringe. Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to create a round robin or alternating samples effect in the EXS24 sampler in Logic Pro 9. Now, if you're not familiar with round robin, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to format a hard drive or flash drive on a Mac. Now, if you've been using Macs for a while, I was not using a microphone. I was, recording at like 480p, and I wasn't editing anything back then. A lot of that content is what sort of jump-started this channel, in particular when Logic 10 came out in 2013. That really boosted the channel up, and the rest has been history. With that main Logic tutorial series I put out, which did so well, and I had such an overwhelming response to it. I think the first video in that series has over 1.5 million views. I mean, it's an outdated tutorial now. Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to my brand new video tutorial series on Logic Pro 10. To have a video that has over 1 million views is like a big deal for me personally, and such a niche market. Like Logic Pro music production is not a huge market, and to think that I can now have a channel with 300,000 subscribers and a regular base of people that I can come back to and show new topics and revise old topics and keep putting content out there and being able to do this for a living is just incredible. So once again, thank you so much. I could not have done this without you. A couple other things I want to talk about before I get into the questions. The first is, originally this video was meant to be done in 2021 when I hit my 10-year mark. I think the 10-year mark was like October, I think it's the end of October of 2021, because I put my first video out toward the end of 2011. So 2021 would have been 10 years. 2022 was 11 years, and work and other things in life and other stresses in life just got the best of me, and I just didn't do the video. I just didn't have time for it. So here I am at 300,000 doing, a check-in with you guys, and, hopefully we'll do it again when we hit 400,000 and 500,000. And I just can't wait to see what I can do and what we can do with this channel to grow it and to create what I hope to be the largest, most followed resource for Logic Pro and music production on the internet. It's already one of the largest channels in regards to Logic Pro and Logic Pro music production on the internet. So once again, thank you for that. I couldn't have done it by myself. Another thing I want to talk about, because I've seen some people ask about it, like, why don't you have a silver play button? I've answered this before in more informal videos, but I think it was way back in 2016, maybe 2017, I hit the 100K mark. I got a notification, an email from Google saying they were sending my 100K subscriber plaque And at the time, I was still working a day job and driving to work every day. And that day, I got the notification on my phone that UPS was going to be, or it was either UPS or FedEx, was delivering my box, my silver play button. And I ended up having to stay at work 3 extra hours. So I got home 3 hours late. And when I got there, the box was gone. So I got a confirmation that it was delivered. But I think what happened is someone stole the box right off of my front porch, unfortunately. So I don't know if anyone out there finds a silver play button on eBay or like at a pawn shop somewhere and it says Music Tech Help Guy, please buy it for me. I will pay you back for it. Actually, no, don't buy it, because there's a lot of fakes out there. People are just like, they're faking the plaque and then they're just putting whatever name on it. So don't buy it. It's fine. I'll wait until we hit 1 million at some point eventually. If anyone at Google or YouTube sees this, please send me my 100K plaque again. I'll pay money for it if I have to. I would love to have it to be able to put here in the back of all of my videos, but unfortunately I think it's gone into the void somewhere. In terms of current plans for the channel and moving forward, every year we say, okay, I'm going to do all these great things and I want to, do this, I want to do this. What are your New Year's resolutions? My New Year's resolutions for the channel, I've been trying to not overwhelm myself, because in years past I have overwhelmed myself and I've put too much on the table and I get disappointed when I'm not able to accomplish it all. So I'm trying to set like really realistic goals for 2023. The first is to finish this new Logic Ultimate Guide to Logic Pro series I'm working on. I'm at this point in time, I'm almost done with the Logic Pro Essentials portion, but I keep finding myself adding little videos to it. But we're gonna get there. I'm trying to do at least 3 videos per week, hopefully 4 moving forward once my other work sort of comes down, it tames down a bit. Other things I'm trying to do for 2023 is I'm trying to grow into the sample library business a bit more. I have a bunch of samples, especially I have like 8 hours worth of drum samples that I recorded a few years back in like a really nice studio with really nice mics, with a really awesome drummer, and with like multiple drum kits. And I've just been sitting on it for 3 years because I haven't had time to put that out. So I'm trying to get into like contact programming and trying to build out some of these samples and recordings I have as instruments that can be sold and used, of course, at an affordable price. I'm not going to jack up prices on sample libraries. I also want to take my Divine Waves sample pack that I made a while back for the EXS24. It does work for sampler, by the way. The installation process is identical. I want to update that. I want to update the marketing for that. I want to put out a Divine Pads or Divine Waves Volume 2 or some sort of offshoot of that. But I also want to try to maybe convert that over to Contact so that people can use it in other DAWs outside of Logic. And I've been thinking about a few other ideas to grow the channel, and some videos that I can do that are not like overwhelming to make, like maybe starting a monthly podcast talking about audio and music production topics, talking about the music business, bringing in some special guests. I've thought about doing some videos that are not purely educational, but I also accept the fact that the channel is an educational resource. It's not edutainment, you know what I mean? It's not entertainment based. I certainly don't have the personality to be like a YouTuber type host, of a show. Like that's not me. I'm an educator first and foremost. I'm a musician and music producer, and then I'm an educator first and foremost. I don't want to. I want to be very careful about dipping into this edutainment type world, because I feel like it sometimes can take away from actual education and actual learning. So the focus will always be on tutorials and learning and Logic Pro. I may even branch out to some other DAWs at some point. I've been saying that for years. I was going to do an Ableton Live course back in Live 9, and I bought the software, and life gets in the way sometimes, and I never finished that series. I never even started the series. I never even released one video on it, even though in the early days I was producing some Ableton Live content here and there. So I have some different ideas for, producing new content and some new series that are maybe some things that I can throw in between tutorials, maybe once a week. I've been doing I've been trying to do like one shorts tutorial like per week, but maybe I can step that up as well. You know, in a perfect world, if all I had to do was produce YouTube content for a living, I could probably get 5 or 6 videos out a week. But, you know, I do production work, I do mixing work, I do curriculum development and design work. Sometimes those things get in the way. Life gets in the way, other work gets in the way. So I've certainly, at the tail end of last year, I did sort of step up my game in terms of the amount of and the quality of content that I've been putting out. So that's kind of like my new plan for 2022. But, you know, I'm open to suggestions. If there's anything in particular that anyone is like, I'd love to see this on your channel, or I think you would do this really well, I'd love to hear your opinions. I'd love to know in the comments below. I very often will grab ideas I see in the comments and roll with them and go with them. A lot of tutorials have come out of questions that have been asked in the comments. A lot of shorts tutorials have come out of questions that have been asked in the comments. Okay, so let's move on to these questions. I've got, like I said, about 50 of these. I'm going to answer as many of them as I possibly can. And none of this is scripted. I haven't prepared any answers for any of these. These are all just, you know, off the cuff. I have ordered some of them because some of them are similar questions. So I've tried to group some of the similar questions together, but I will leave timestamps below for every single question that I answer. So up first, question number 1. From Brett Grace, congratulations on the 300K. Here's a question for you. If you decided to give Apple the flick, what DAW would you consider migrating to? Bitwig and Reaper look interesting, maybe Haps. Great question. So the reason why I moved to Apple in the first place was because I got so sick of dealing with Windows computers not like synchronizing to audio interfaces very well. I don't think it's much of an issue now as it used to be, but there was a specific point in my career where I was recording a band and I had a Windows PC. I was lugging around. I was doing like site recordings for people. So I'd do like live recordings of concerts. I would do like, you know, I'd record bands in their home, you know, or in their rehearsal space. So I was recording a band in their rehearsal space and I was using Cubase at the time. And the computer, I always had issues with this computer dropping the interface, like in the middle of drum tracking, just the interface disconnects. And I swapped out the cable, I swapped out the interface, I tried different ports on the computer and nothing worked. So I canceled the session. I went out that weekend, bought my very first MacBook, came back, plugged in the same interface, and it was flawless. And that's what sold me with Apple. It's not necessarily that their hardware is better. It's that their operating system is better and it just works. There are certainly glitches. Like right now with Ventura, I am like not happy with Ventura. Like I've had so many little just glitchy things happen, but none of them have really been logic issues. None of them have really been hardware issues. They're just weird like Finder bugs, you know. Even today, while I was taking screenshots of all these questions, I'd take a screenshot and the screenshot wouldn't go away. It was just there permanently. I had to like restart the computer to get rid of it. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. If I had to give Apple the flick, what DAW would I consider migrating to? It'd probably be Cubase. I started on Sonar in the early days. I used Cubase for a little while. After I left Windows, I moved to Mac. I started using Pro Tools and Logic pretty much equally at that point, and I've never really gone back. But I have checked out the more recent versions of Cubase. I even did a little tutorial introductory course on Cubase over at Mac Pro Video. Cubase seems to be like the Windows equivalent of Logic. Like it's good for MIDI stuff. It's good for recording. It's decent for electronic music. You can kind of do a little bit of everything. Normally, I would say Pro Tools, but I just can't stand the Pro Tools MIDI and songwriting and producing workflow. And lately, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, I've lost a lot of faith in Pro Tools. Like I own a copy of it, but I don't even know that I have it installed on this computer right now. I only install it when I need to use it, and then I get rid of it. And then I just, you know, I only use Pro Tools when I need to, because I have such a love-hate relationship with Pro Tools. So Cubase, definitely. I'd probably move over, if I had to leave Apple, I'd build like a custom workstation computer, put Cubase on it, and probably Pro Tools as well, just to have it. All right, second question. If you're given a secondary DAW, which one would you choose? It's the same question, basically. Divya Pandya. Again, it would be Cubase. Yeah. I mean, if you asked me 5 years ago, I probably would have said Pro Tools, but these days, Cubase. Yeah, Cubase. I might try out Luna, but Cubase seems to do everything that I would need to do in Logic. Luis Vigo asks, congratulations. I know this is not a question. I had circumstances to move to a Windows-based laptop. So can you recommend any DAW like Logic in Windows? Again, I think Cubase is going to be your best bet here. If you wanted to do all of the things that Logic does with a similar workflow, Cubase is going to be your go-to. The only thing I'll warn about Cubase is it has a pretty steep learning curve, and it's not easy to use at first. Like, going from Logic to Cubase is not easy. Going from like Logic to like Studio One or Pro Tools is not that horrible. Even going from like Logic to Pro Tools or even Studio One's not that difficult, but the learning curve in Cubase is pretty tough. It's pretty tough to learn, but once you get it, it's fine. So yeah, once again, Cubase. And I think this next question is the same thing. Are any Logic Pro alternatives available for Windows users? Cubase. So that's why I said I'm going to be grouping some of these questions together, because some of them are very similar in context or in topic. So another question here, DAW-related question from That Guitarist. I found your channel during college in the UK studying music tech, and I'm now full-time working in audio post-production for TV. So my question would be, what leads you to primarily use Logic over Pro Tools? Pro Tools, like I said, I have a love-hate relationship with Pro Tools. I used to use Pro Tools quite a bit. When I worked at studios, I would pretty much do all of my recording and some of the editing there in Pro Tools. I would take those projects back to my home studio, drop them in Logic, finish a lot of the editing and the more technical stuff there. In some cases, I would mix at home. Other times, I would take those tracks back to the studio, drop them in Pro Tools again, and finish the mixes. Nowadays, I am like pretty much using Logic 99.5% of the time. The only time I'm opening up Pro Tools is when I need to do something with the audio suite, like vocal alignment. It's really convenient to do there. Aligning multiple backing harmonies or backing vocals to a lead vocal, that's something I would do in Pro Tools just because of the audio suite. Other than that, like, I'm just not using Pro Tools at all, because I'm doing 100% of my work here from my home studio, as opposed to in times past where I was going back and forth between my home studio and a studio, or maybe my home studio, a studio, and a school I was working at. So my situation is different, and therefore I am not using Pro Tools that often these days. Another point to this is I've just gotten so disheartened by Avid's lack of caring for their own product, and the fact that I literally have not had a stable functioning version of Pro Tools that runs well in like the past 4 years. And I've owned like 4 separate computers in the last 4 years to try to combat this problem. I had an old Mac Pro Tower. It ran like trash. I upgraded to a 2019 iMac, which was like a souped up iMac. I mean, it had like all the whistles and bells, ran like shit on that machine. Now I have a Mac Studio, a $4,000 machine, $4,300 machine. Logic runs like a dream. Virtually every other app works like a dream. As soon as I tried to run Pro Tools on it, it didn't work very well, and I got crashes. I know that Avid has updated Pro Tools for use with Ventura. It does work a touch better, but it still has so many issues. Like Pro Tools has crashed on me probably twice as many times as Logic or any other DAW has crashed on me and caused problems, and just weird problems that I can't explain. Like, just, it doesn't function as advertised. And the older I get, the less I am willing to mess around with software, and I'm more willing to just be like, you know what, screw this, I'm done with it, I'm moving on to something else. So that's certainly like a viewpoint I've taken lately with Pro Tools. So yeah, it doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for me. I've had really bad luck with Pro Tools, and I know a lot of people who own like HDX systems and like fully spec'd out Avid systems that love it, and it works great at their studios. But it's using a native Pro Tools system with an Apogee Symphony interface has not worked for me. I've had too many problems with Pro Tools to give them any more of my money. Jago asks, how did you get so savvy about Logic Pro? Did you take a course, or is it all from just using it? It's impressive how well you know your way around the software. I learned it by using it. I learned it by starting off doing live recording work, then recording with bands, using other DAWs, and just learning and educating myself about recording techniques and DAW techniques. Because once you like master one DAW, like most of them are pretty easy to figure out. There's like a few, weird things, like I was saying about Cubase before. The only like educational resource that I've used specifically for Logic Pro is David Namani's Apple Pro or Logic Pro books. I used those in the early days, but it wasn't necessarily to teach myself. It was more because I was teaching classes that required a textbook. So I was using like the Logic Pro 9 textbooks from David Namani, and they're great books. He still does them today. So if you're looking for like more of like a textbook format to learn from, David Namani's got great books out there for Logic Pro. But yeah, I just learned it from using it. I've been using it since version 6 in college, and that's really how I got into it, and now I teach it. And the other thing is, when you teach something for a living, it forces you to stay relevant and keep your knowledge relevant. Like if I wasn't teaching either on YouTube or, developing curriculum and content for a college, I probably would not stay as current with the software as I should. It's just using it and just being a recording engineer for 17 years of my life. That's really how I got used to using Logic Pro. Follow-up question. Any chance you can do a video on incorporating V drums and Superior Drummer? Not sure if you use SD3 at all. Yeah, that's a video I've been thinking about doing for a long time, like how to take your electronic drum kit that you pretty much only use for practice and hook it up as like a MIDI output, like a MIDI controller, because most of the drum brains on those units will have MIDI in and out. So you can take the MIDI out and you can plug that into your audio interface if it has a MIDI input, and you can receive that drum data, the notes from each drum stroke and the velocity, and it'll send that information into Logic, and you can record it, and then you can actually add any drum instrument you want. It doesn't even have to be Superior Drummer. It can be anything, and you can essentially play the kit in software with an electronic drum kit, which I totally understand with people nowadays recording at home and wanting to produce their own band and not wanting to go to a studio and pay $500, $600, $800 a day to track drums the right way. They may want to, just pull up Superior Drummer and play in their performances as opposed to, typing them in. I've done it before. I don't do it much now, but I'll think about it. If more people want to see a video like this, I'll certainly do that. All right, next up, I got a few questions from Shubham Sharma. First question, what city do you live? That's pretty personal. I live in Florida, and I live about an hour outside of Tampa. That's where I'll leave it. 2, where did you learn music programming and Logic Pro? Music programming started when I was a kid. I had an early version of a MIDI sequencing software that was purely staff notation based. I honestly don't remember what the name of the software was, but I was about 13 or 14 years old. A friend of mine gave me a copy of it. This is back before, this is back when you could just take the CD, install it, and the serial number is right there. You just type it in and you're good. So whoever has access to the CD can install it. And I started making little like beats and making little compositions. And I wish I had those compositions around because I've lost all of them. But, probably from the age of 13 to the age of like 15 or 16, I probably composed like 20 or 30 little instrumental MIDI compositions. And that's really how I got into like music programming specifically. Logic Pro, like I said in the previous question, it's just from 17 years of being really longer, almost 20 years of being a musician and recording engineer. So that's really where that comes from, just using Logic every single day as part of my job, part of my hobbies, part of my songwriting, 3, how many musical instruments do you know how to play? My main instrument is guitar, but I also play piano pretty much equally as well. I mean, I'm not like a virtuoso piano player, but piano is the main format I use to get my ideas out. I'm not sitting here coming up with song arrangement ideas on guitar. I may come up with some riffs. Most of the time, I'm sitting here with a MIDI controller. I'm playing different chords. I'm experimenting with different melodies. So guitar and piano are my main 2 instruments. I play bass, but I play bass like a guitar player plays bass. I can play drums okay. Like if it's like rock or metal drums, I can play rock or metal drums. I can sing okay. I really don't like the tone of my voice. I really don't like my singing voice. The subscribers have been very, very generous with me on my singing lately. But yeah, I really don't like the tone of my voice, but I can sing. I can hold a tune and I can sing a melody. You don't want me to be your lead vocalist, but I could be a good backing vocalist or studio vocalist if I need to be. In college, I played euphonium, which is like a little tuba. And then in high school, I played tuba. I actually played a little bit of tuba in college as well. I went to music school. Synthesizers, the synthesizer count. Number 4, what other work do you do besides music? These days, I work completely 100% within the music industry. I used to do some AV work. I used to do some music sales work. I used to work in a music store in college. My very first job was Wendy's. When I was 17 years old. Then I moved up to working at a music store. Then I moved up to doing some recording work, doing AV work. I did some like theater and like live recording work when I was in college. I would like record and master live concert recordings. That was my main job for 2 years. After that, I moved on to doing mostly recording and mixing work. And then I started teaching college courses, which I've been doing for like the past decade. And then now I've sort of moved on to curriculum development for music production. So basically my income nowadays is YouTube, mixing work, and curriculum design for music production programs. I'm not really doing anything outside of music and audio production. And the last question, how long are you learning music? I think you're at, how long have I been working with music since making money from music since I was like 18. So I'm 37, so 19 years. How long have I just been learning music and playing music? Since I was 10, maybe. My grandmother's piano. Whenever I started playing my grandmother's piano, I had to say probably the single point in my life that got me. There's a couple little different points, but when I was like maybe 10 or 9 years old, my parents bought us, my brother and sister and I, a little Yamaha practice piano. It was just this little tabletop thing, but it wasn't a toy. And I really started like playing chords and hearing things in my head and learning to sort of internalize the sounds of music and the intervals and the scales and the chords. And I didn't know what a chord was. I didn't know what a major chord was. I didn't know what a minor chord was, but I knew if I played C, E, G, I get a certain sound. If I play E, G, B, I get a different sound. If I play these notes, and I start to internalize the tone of the notes. And I really truly learned music by ear. And then I went to music school later and learned, how to do things formally. And in high school, I was in the marching band, I was in the concert band, I was in the theater, I was in the jazz band. So I learned a lot of formal structure throughout grade school. And then when I got to college, I was playing in the marching band, the concert band, the orchestra. I did a little bit in the orchestra. I even sang in the choir in college. I was in a jazz trio in college. So that's how I really got into music in terms of it being a job for me. But in terms of how long have I been learning music, I'd say maybe since the age of 9. And then, it was about 11 or 12 when I picked up guitar, and my dad taught me a few chords on guitar, and I started, jamming and playing. But in the early days, I was always very resistant to learn music formally. And I would say to anyone learning music now who's a beginner, like, don't resist the formality of music, because ultimately it's not about annoying theory. It's about internalizing the sounds that you hear and being able to interpret them instantly in your head. And that's the way I feel about music and music theory is just, it's a language that you have to learn to communicate with and interpret. Next question from Victor Sanchez. How much have you been using Logic Pro? So how long have I been using it, or how much have I been using it? Congrats for the 300K. Thank you, Victor. How much have I been using it? About 99.5% of the time. Occasionally, I will use Studio One for mastering albums that I know are going to CD. But nowadays, I've just been using Logic for pretty much everything. And like I said before, occasionally I will use Pro Tools for vocal alignment because I just like the audio suite workflow. How long have I been using Logic? I started using Logic before I even had an Apple computer to use Logic, if that makes any sense. I was using Logic in the computer lab at my school. So I think it was Logic 6 or 7 maybe. So I don't know, since I was 19 or 20 maybe. So it's been, yeah, probably 17, 18 years since I've been using Logic. Why Not Dave says, thanks for doing the Q&A. Any thoughts on Mac specs for music production using Logic? Will an M1 work? M1 Pro, Max? I was kind of hoping we'd have a mini M2 Pro by now, but alas, we have to wait. I'm sure the studio can handle any, I think he's referring to the Mac Studio, can handle any music-related jobs thrown at it, but do we need to spend that much? Thanks for any enlightenment you can add to the subject. Good luck with everything in 2023. So my opinion on this is nowadays, if you get Apple Silicon, you can run Logic Pro on virtually any M1 or M2 machine. The question is, are you using a lot of plugins and a lot of sample libraries, or are you simply using it to record? Are you using it to compose? Are you using a lot of virtual instruments, things like that? If that's the case, I would say get at least 8 gigabytes of RAM, but most of these computers now come with 8 gigs of RAM. So if you can afford to, maybe upgrade to the 16 gig of RAM option if you can. In terms of processing speed, the one thing that I know is going to give you a problem on Mac Minis and like MacBook Airs, like some of the cheaper options, is the M1 and M2 CPU cores are generally speaking kind of slower individual cores, but you get like 8 or 16 cores in the computer, so it sort of makes up for it. But audio, in my experience, benefits from faster single core performance. I'm not saying you can't run Logic on a Mac Mini, but I think really if you want something that's going to be future proofed, I would get at least an upgraded Mac Mini or at least an upgraded MacBook of some kind or a MacBook Pro, and that really should be your baseline. I'm using a $4,000 Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra chip. Do you need that? Absolutely not. I only got that because of video, because I do video work. I bought this one, the M1 Ultra, so it's a 20-core CPU, 48-core GPU. Do you need that for music production? Absolutely not. If I were you, I would either go with the Mac Studio M1 Max with the 10-core CPU and have it be like a desktop workstation, or I would go with the MacBook Pro. And even if you get one of the cheaper models, like the 13-inch, like that should be good enough for you. It's not only is it Apple Silicon, it's also M2. It also comes with an 8-core CPU. And with 10 cores of GPU, I mean, you can still do some like light video editing and you'll be totally fine. Another thing that a lot of people forget about with new Macs is they forget how ridiculously small the stock hard drives are, the internal storage. I would recommend upgrading, like regardless of what computer you get, I would recommend upgrading the internal drive to at least 1 terabyte. If you're using a lot of sample libraries and you don't want to store those externally, I would get at least 2 terabytes, because even on my machine, I got the 1 terabyte version. I regret it. I kind of want the 2 terabyte version because I'm already running out of drive space. Hank Jansen says, rock on, man. Congratulations. I had a working knowledge of Logic Pro, but you've helped me get under the hood in many ways. If you could add only one plugin to the stock plugins, what would it be? The problem is I think there's a few new plugins Logic needs. One, Logic needs a dynamic EQ of some kind. And it also needs like a newer transient processor of some kind. And they also need like some sort of like decent saturation plugin. Like if Logic really wants to tap into the electronic music, pop music production market, they're going to need those three things. Even the dynamic EQ, I could probably like leave off the table, but they need a good saturation plugin. The Exciter's okay, but like I'd love to see a multi-band saturation plugin because so many electronic music producers are saturating their tracks, and not just the master, they're saturating individual elements to give it that, that hyped vibe that, it's so common in electronic music. Actually, I take all that back. If I could get one new plugin in Logic, it would be for them to license either Metatune from Slate Digital or Auto-Tune from Antares, or even like license Melodyne from Celemony. That's what they need, because flex pitch frankly sucks. I try to use it. I try to demonstrate it in tutorials for people who want to use it. Flex pitch consistently makes my recordings sound worse just by simply applying flex pitch. So I haven't had much luck with flex pitch, but when we get to flex pitch in the ultimate guide, maybe I'll discover that they've changed it and improved it. But yeah, maybe like some sort of new pitch correction plugin, or license a plugin like Pro Tools has, like Studio One has. Instead of trying to develop our own, how about we just license one from another company? So I think that's something that Logic could totally do. Next up, Richard asks, if you could only use stock Logic plugins, what would you consider a great vocal chain setup? Congrats on 300K. So my vocal chain setup, if I had to only use stock plugins, is going to very closely mimic my vocal chain that I would use in like a studio application. Like typically I like EQ first, I like some sort of like optical compression second, and then after the optical compression, I like some sort of like solid state fast acting compressor. Sort of the bread and butter of this would just be channel EQ and then a compressor just using the opto circuit. And the opto circuit is to just like smooth out the dynamics overall, but opto compressors, like the LA2A, for example, they have very slow attack times. So a lot of times the transient of the front end of the word will get through the compressor and then the signal gets compressed. So anytime you look at printed tracks that have gone through like an LA2A, you'll see the front end of phrases tend to have this transient, and then the rest of it's like super smooth. So what I'll typically do is after the LA2A or after the optical compressor, I'll add another compressor. And this one, you could just use the Platinum Digital and use like a really short attack time to control those transients. Now, other things that I add to my signal chain, like there's no direct like version of it in Logic using all stock plugins, but I like to use the Antares Avox Warm plugin. Anytime I get recordings from someone who's done recordings with a solid state mic or a transformerless mic, I like to just add a little bit of drive, just a touch of tube drive, and it just helps bring out the signal, brings out the details a bit more. To do something like this in Logic, like the Exciter plugin isn't really going to get you the same type of sound, but what you could do is you could load from the Vintage EQ collection, the Vintage Tube EQ. This is going to give you like a Pultec style EQ, but you may not even use the EQ. You might just use the drive here. And this is probably going to get you the closest type of like tube drive sound in Logic. So you could use the drive to kind of give it a boost. Another plugin that I add usually before or after the drive or saturation plugin is a third-party plugin called Gullfoss. Gullfoss is this like automatic EQ plugin that has like multiple bands that can auto boost or auto tame certain resonances and recordings. I use this a lot as like either the first or second plugin in my vocal chains, because I'll often get recordings from people recording in their home studio, and their home studio may not necessarily be like a professionally treated space. And so therefore there are certain resonances in the room that need to be fixed, or maybe they're using a cheap microphone. So this can also help to correct some of the imbalances in the frequency balance with Gullfoss, although there's no equivalent of this in Logic. You're just gonna have to kind of do it by ear with the channel EQ. The only other plugin that's like an essential plugin for me in a vocal chain is also like a gate at the very end, just to bring down the level in between phrases and in between, you know, gaps in the vocal. You can go through and you can manually cut out all those things, but I found that just compressing or gating those areas a little bit really helps. The problem is, you know, Logic's gate will work for this, but you have to like set the reduction to something a bit higher. Like the goal here is not to drop the signal down to nothing in between phrases. The goal is to duck down the signal a little bit in between phrases, and you have to be very gentle with your attack and hold and release times. And it's going to take a lot of toying with to get a good setting. The plugin I use instead of using Logic's gate for this is Rvox from Waves. It's like one of the few Waves plugins I actually like because it's got the best vocal gate of any plugin I've ever used. It reacts to the voice in a way where words don't get cut out, consonants don't get cut out, soft passages don't get cut out. It's a very gentle gate, so it's not really fully gating. It's just ducking the signal in between the phrases in a really nice way. In a lot of situations, I don't even use the compressor on this. I may use the gain adjustment just to kind of pull up or pull down the gain if it's a little high. Rvox is an incredible gate plugin for voice. It just sucks that Waves is such a horrible company. And Waves, their marketing structure is freaking horrible because you end up paying for the same damn plugin like 3 or 4 times just to upgrade it. I probably bought Rvox for like $35 or something on like some deal that they had years ago, like probably 10 years ago. And I've probably had to rebuy Rvox to pay the upgrade fee, you know, of another $25 for it, like another 5 times. So that's the reason why I don't really use Waves plugins anymore, because I think the way their upgrade structure is put together it's just a scam. You'll end up buying a plugin, really liking it, and then when they want you to upgrade, you end up having to pay for the plugin again and again and again and again. You have to pay for each of the upgrades, which is so stupid. Like no other company does that. You know, if you release a new version of Rvox and you call it Rvox 2 and it's a brand new plugin with new features, fine. But if it's the same damn plugin it has been for the last 10 years and the only thing you've done is maybe change the interface once, I shouldn't have to pay $400 over the course of 10 years for a plugin. That it is what it is. I haven't found a better version other than Rvox. So, like, if anyone knows of a similar plugin to Rvox, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to check it out, and I'd love to completely get rid of Waves plugins on my computer for once and for all. So yeah, like something with some saturation in it, an EQ to make frequency adjustments, an opto compressor, a solid state compressor to control the transients, and then some sort of a gate. Beyond that, everything else is creative. What reverb you want to use, what delay you want to use, what modulation you want to use. Typically these days for reverbs, I'm using either Valhalla Vintage Verb. For more ethereal things, I'm using Native Instruments ROM. And then for like vocal modulation, I'm using the Howard Benson vocal multiplier these days. Those seem to be my go-to time-based effects. And for delays, honestly, I'm just using Logic's tape delay most of the time. Learn with Salim, or Salim says, "You're simply amazing. Do you think you could do a video explaining the Logic mixer, buses, VCAs, etc.?" So I actually already have. I have a couple different videos. If you search up MusicTechHelpGuy VCA, this video will pop up. It's buses versus VCAs versus groups versus track stacks. What's the difference? I did this video 4 years ago. It's still relevant today. It's one of my most popular videos. And in that video, I explained the difference between those. I also did a video recently, very recently, on the mixer. Yes, if you just search MusicTechHelpGuy mixer, you'll get video 25 of my ultimate guide, where I do a breakdown of each of the channel strip components. Howard Yermish says, "Congratulations on 300K. I'd love to see tutorials on using Logic Pro with devices like the Torso T1 or other hardware synthesizers. to create ideas, inspiration, capture in Logic Pro, etc. Yeah, I definitely need to do some like hardware synthesizer tutorials where I show how to route Logic to a hardware synth and then input the audio back into Logic. So basically the way this works is you have MIDI on like a software instrument track or a MIDI track in Logic. You output that MIDI out of your audio interface using a MIDI output on your audio interface. You attach a MIDI cable going out to in on your hardware synthesizer, and then you take the hardware or the audio outputs of the synthesizer and you connect those back to audio inputs or line level inputs on your audio interface. So you create this like loop of outputting MIDI, inputting audio. You can do this pretty simply in Logic. It's a little easier to do nowadays than it was before. You just create a new software instrument, but instead of using a instrument plugin, you switch this over to an external MIDI or USB device. And then if it's like a USB device, you should be able to select it here. You can route it out of the output of your audio interface. And then you choose like an audio input where the sound is coming back in through. It'll bring up this external instrument plugin. And again, you can set the destination here. And that's basically where the MIDI is going to. My current audio interface, I don't believe has MIDI ins and outs on it. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Does it? Yeah, this one doesn't have MIDI in and out on it. But a lot of audio interfaces will have MIDI in and out, and you could choose your interface MIDI output port here. That'll send the signal out of it. You connect the MIDI cable to your hardware synth. You select a MIDI channel, which is usually just going to be all, and then you set an input, and that's where you would plug your audio output from the synthesizer back into Logic through. And so you're essentially using your hardware synth like a software instrument, and you can compensate for latency as well, and you can adjust the input volume and all other things like that. Yeah, that would be a pretty detailed breakdown. I need to get my hands on an audio interface that actually has MIDI, but it can be done. I know all sorts of people who have hardware synth studios where they have everything hooked up at all times, and they can very simply switch between their various different hardware instruments. So it can be done. Girish Hawther says, greetings from India, big fan of the channel. Been following you for almost 5 years now. Would love for you to show us an updated video on how you integrate hardware gear like compressors and EQ with Logic and explain it in such a way that it's not really complicated. Also, some recommendations on what kind of hardware would benefit intermediate music producers and show us the workflow that works best. Thanks in advance. Yeah, that's a great topic that I will touch on at some point. I use a few select pieces of hardware for mixing. Neve Portico, which I use for mastering. It goes on pretty much every single master I do. I've got the Stam Audio 1176. I've got the Bluey 1176. I got a couple of Golden Age Comp 2As, which I use for mainly for mixing vocals. Let me move that over there. So yeah, we got the Neve up here. The two 1176s, the pair of Golden Age Comp 2As, which I use for vocals. And at the bottom, I still keep this thing around. It's an Art Pro VLA dual channel or 2-channel optical compressor. It's not like the best, so it's definitely like a budget unit. But years ago, I upgraded the tubes and I upgraded the transformers in this. So I modded it. So it sounds a little better. But now that I have these Golden Age Comp 2As, like I don't even need this unit anymore. So once I buy another piece of hardware, this is probably going to get taken out of the rack at some point. But setting this up is actually relatively simple. Even in this mix, I've got hardware routed up. So what you do is you pull up this IO plugin. This is under utility. And then what you do is you set the input and output channel that you're going to be sending and receiving audio on. Now, right now, my secondary interface, my Symphony, is turned off, so I don't have access to output 5 and 6. But essentially, you would choose an input and output other than like the main input and output, like 1 and 2 are usually your main inputs and outputs. So I could use 5 and 6. It'll send signal out of the interface into the hardware. Then you route the hardware back to the appropriate input. So in this case, it's input 5 and 6. And then you click the ping button here. Basically, it shoots like a little pop through the signal chain and detects the latency and compensates for that latency. And then you use your hardware just like you would a plugin. It's just external rather than internal. That's how it works. But yeah, I'll definitely do a deep dive on that at some point in the future. In terms of what hardware to buy, I mean, the practicality of using hardware in a home studio nowadays, it's becoming less and less practical, in my opinion, for home studio enthusiasts to own hardware. And this, it pains me to say this because I love using hardware. I'm not like an analog like purist by any means. I mix with a hybrid workflow. So I use several plugins. I use a few select pieces of hardware. And my best advice for anyone who's trying to get into hardware mixing is to buy hardware that you can use on vocals, because that's the most important thing in the mix typically, which is why I invested in the Comp 2As, not just one of them, but two of them, so I can process two channels at a time. What I typically do is I'll print the effect back into Logic, and then this allows me to repurpose that channel for another track in Logic. You know, if I got 8 vocal channels, I'll go through and process all 8 vocal channels with the Comp 2As one by one, or 2 by 2, really, because I have 2 of them. And I just print that back into Logic. So I already have this really nice opto-compressed vocal in Logic that I can add other plugins to, but I'm already starting with something that sounds great. When you have more inputs and outputs in hardware than you do inputs and outputs on your audio interface, it's time to get a patch bay. When you have less inputs and outputs of hardware than you do inputs and outputs on your audio interface, you don't really need a patch bay. You can just hardwire things, and you know, I could keep the Portico permanently on channel 5 and 6. I could keep the Comp 2As on channel 3 and 4 permanently. You know, it's not just about what hardware to get and what plugin you got to use in Logic. It's also like you have to think about possibly restructuring your entire setup in order to make that happen, because now you're involving patch bays. Do I want a TRS patch bay? Do I want to spend the money and get a TT patch bay? Do I want to do all the soldering myself and do a point-to-point TT patch bay? Do I want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a bunch of DB25 cables because I got a DB25 patch bay? So there's all these other factors involved that you have to think about even before thinking about what hardware you want. JT Fuller says, bruh, you did a video like 4 years ago about input processing through an aux track. Man, I did that and the latency is bad. Is there another way to do this without all of the latency? I lowered the buffer size and it's still bad. I even tried low latency mode and it still didn't even register on the audio track. Is there a different way, or do I need an outboard compressor? I learned so much from you. It's crazy, and the series you have going is invaluable information. Thanks. Thanks, and congratulations to getting 300K. Outstanding work. Thank you so much. I think your problem is maybe you have something else in your project that's causing the latency, because if you open a blank project and you create one audio track and one aux track, add a compressor to the aux track or whatever, you know, plugin you're trying to add, you shouldn't get that much latency. You either have something else going on in your project that's causing the latency, like you have other plugins that are causing the latency, or you're trying to use plugins in real time that cause extra latency. That video was a very niche video. I don't really recommend most people go that route unless you're specifically trying to maybe input process something so that you don't have to process it later. Like if you're doing, I don't know, a podcast, like maybe you're recording a podcast, maybe you have a live stream of it, like a live feed coming from Logic, and you just want it to be pre-processed, you could do that. It was, again, it was more, that video was almost more of like a proof of concept than like, hey, this is a great technique for all of us to be using. It's not, it really isn't, because nowadays computers are so fast, there's no real need to process things up front. I don't know exactly what you're trying to record, but if it's like voice, for example, you might invest in like a little 4-channel 500 series rack with a preamp, an EQ, and a compressor in it, and just go straight through that. You know, go straight in, plug your mic straight into the preamp, go through the EQ and compressor, dial in a setting that you use for your voice all the time, and then run that straight into Logic as a line level input rather than a mic level input. And then everything's handled outside of Logic and you don't have to worry about that latency. But yeah, if you're just using like one plugin on an aux track and it's like the basic compressor or EQ plugin that doesn't cause a lot of latency, you shouldn't have latency. If you're getting latency, you're either probably trying to use a plugin that causes latency, or you have other plugins in your project that are causing the latency. Next up, I have another question from Victor Sanchez. Have you ever tried to run backing tracks using Logic Pro? Yes, but probably not in the way you're thinking, like not with like a full band setting. I did use my laptop for some live performances I did of just me playing guitar, and I basically just had backing tracks of drums and bass and synths playing, and I was just playing, rhythm and lead parts on top of it. You can do it if you want to do like professional backing tracks, though. Find some sort of like MIDI sync system, or you're gonna have to keep all of your performers perfectly playing to a click at all times. So if you're going to let's say these are a bunch of backing tracks that I want to follow and sing along to, or maybe I have like one more musician and myself singing or something. What I would do is I would go to the all view in your mixer. You're gonna find the click track, like the actual track for the click track. If I can find it in here. Here it is. And you're going to route this with a bus, a send, out to a hardware output on your audio interface. And then you're going to have to route that to some sort of in-ear monitoring system where all of your musicians can hear the backing tracks along with a fairly prominent click. And they're going to have to stay in time with the click. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to have to set up some sort of like beat clock tapping system where you can synchronize the tempo of Logic to whatever you're working with, which is a lot easier to do now with the Ableton Link. There's now an option for Ableton Link, so that makes it a little easier if you're trying to do like time synced backing tracks where you want like this dynamic tempo to sort of follow you as you're performing. That's going to be much more difficult to do. But if you just have a couple musicians, you need to keep everyone in time. Routing a click track out of Logic to your audio interface and then to some sort of in-ear monitoring system is not that difficult. Getting all of the hardware to do so and actually implementing it in real time is a whole other issue, because there are so many amazing musicians I've worked with over the years that cannot play to a click, and like frankly just there's no way I would trust them to stay in time in a live performance to a click. It's possible, it's definitely possible, but I don't personally do it because I'm not really performing that much anymore. Mike Hatfield says, congrats on the 300K subs. I live in the UK and I've followed your channel for years now. It's very exciting to see it grow to this size. One thing I find lacking on YouTube and would love to see you do is a Logic Pro video series on the basics of programming drum beats for non-drummers, using one-shots, not drummer tracks. What are the mechanics of drums? What affects kick and snare placement, different accents, ghost notes, syncopation, maybe even some advice for writing in odd time signatures, as well as 4/4, 3/4. Hope all that's useful. I'm not sure whatever comes next will be equally awesome. Cheers, Josh. Yeah, I mean, programming drums, I think what he's talking about is programming acoustic drums, which I've done a fair amount of in my day. Almost all acoustic drums that I put out that are programmed these days are demos. So I'll put together a rough demo, and then I'll usually bring a drummer in or record the drums myself and try to match the groove and try to match the style of the original demo. But yeah, it's certainly like being able to program acoustic drum samples and acoustic drum instruments is a craft in itself. So yeah, I'll keep that on the back burner. That might be a good topic to have like in a mini series or something. Half of the problem is like thinking like a drummer, because there's so many, especially in rock and metal bands, there are so many like controlling guitar players that control all of the creative process and want their drummer to play the drums just like this in a certain way. And honestly, some of the best recordings I think I've ever made are ones where I just let the drummer do their own thing, and ultimately like the cumulative creative aspect of recording, like taking into account other people's ideas, actually results in a better product, a more interesting product, rather than something that's just exact, and going by one person's creative vision. But yeah, I mean, I'll keep it on the back burner for sure, but it's definitely something that's tricky because you have to really get in there with the velocity, pulling velocities down, and then like humanizing the recording and like moving certain notes slightly ahead of the grid, others behind the grid, and mimicking the natural flow of a drummer. Like a step sequencer when it plays eighth notes is just perfect eighth notes, right? But a drummer's got a little bit of like even when a drummer's playing completely straight, they have a little bit of swing. It's just the natural mechanism and physics of moving your arms that gives a slight delay to some notes and gives a slight push to other notes. So yeah, that would be a great course to do. Maybe I'll do it like as a secondary course or something, you know, drum programming or something along those lines. So yeah, great idea. I'll definitely keep it on the back burner. Tony Anderson asks, why do my catch settings not save in Logic Pro? I've gone into project settings and enabled all of them. I've also enabled them in the main arrangement window, but each time I click on a region or make an edit, the blue catch logo turns gray and will not stay on. It's been driving me insane. So what he's talking about is this button right here. This is the catch button. And, you know, to be honest, I'm not sure why it would deselect, because essentially what this does is it allows the playback of the screen, of the cursor, of the playhead to remain on screen. So if I turn this on and press play, the playhead always stays on screen. But if you right click on this, and you can go into the settings too, it's the same settings. You can choose to catch when starting. You can choose to catch when moving. And then there's another content position for link mode. But if you turn these off, and then you turn this off and press play, the playhead's just going to keep rolling. So you can see the screen didn't catch up to the playhead. Normally, if you just turn these first two options on here, that's enough. And even if you have this turned off, as soon as you set the playhead somewhere, it turns it on. And anytime you just press play, it automatically turns it on as well. So unless there's some weird like link mode thing going on, like check your link options here. See if link is turned off, and then see if this third option is turned off. Because if this is turned on and the link, one of these link options are also turned on, it may affect it differently. This is one of the few questions I had to try off screen because I wasn't really sure what the issue was. If that doesn't help, I would recommend trying to reset your Logic preferences or settings. Just search up like reset Logic preferences. It'll bring you to an Apple support page. And down at the very bottom, it's called if Logic Pro isn't working. At the very bottom, there's two options here: reset Logic Pro preferences and delete Logic Pro PLIST file. Try both of these if the first option doesn't work. And then if these don't work, do a fresh install of Logic and see if that fixes it. Because that seems like some sort of like a preference bug. GNBoy1 says, hey Josh, help me if you can. Not the Beatles song. While just looking at control surfaces in the settings, I accidentally tapped a key on my keyboard and saw a parameter change. I don't know what I did, so I exited the settings. Now my F3 key is silent until I constantly bypass all control surfaces. I tried a reset, but I still have to do the bypass thing. Is there a permanent fix to get the F3 key working again? That's a tricky one. So I think what you're talking about is going up to Logic, going to control surfaces, setup, and then you were probably perusing through like the different control surfaces probably in here. And I think maybe what you did is you might have accidentally installed one of these. It's for whatever reason thinking that there's a control surface installed. So let's see if I can actually get one of these to install here. Or hang on, add, there we go. I think all you really need to do is just delete the control surface here that you're not using, and that should fix it. I think that should fix it. I don't know why it would take over the F keys on your keyboard, but the F keys may have one function without a control surface hooked up and then another function with that particular control surface. So I would recommend just deleting any control surfaces you have here, especially if you don't actually have any of them connected. What you can also try to do is you can do the same thing I told the last guy is try resetting your preferences or try deleting the PLIST file and see if that fixes the issue. Vincent Vidal says, hey, congrats. I've been following your channel for a while and I'm better at mixing and mastering thanks to you. That's awesome. I don't know if it's too late for my question, but I have two. One, is there an easy and fast way to add crossfades on all of my audio tracks at once? I used to be able to do it with 2 clicks with Digital Performer. And 2, is there a way to indicate a beginning and end of a song rather than using or other than using the cycle zone so that I can just set it when I bounce? Yeah, I'm going to answer your second question first. Logic has a like 0 bar that is kind of hard to get to. There it is. It's hard to get to because of this divider I have here from Live Loops, but this little thing right here, it's this little gray triangle there. That's technically the beginning of your song. Setting the beginning point's a little more difficult, but I think if I turn off the snap, there we go. So like if I wanted all of my bounces to start like just a hair before the song comes in, I could set it like there, right? So the true beginning of my project is now just a slight hair before bar 1. And then if I want all of my end points to be, say, right here at this master VCA fade. So I've got a VCA fade right here in the middle of 138. What you can do is scroll over all the way to the right, and you'll see this little marker. This is the song end point, and you can simply just set that end point. And there you go. That's how you do it. It's a little weird in Logic. I tend to just use the cycle range for my bounce range, but I can totally see how it would get annoying. Like this happens to me all the time where I'll have a bounce range. The client asks for a revision of some kind. I do a revision, but in the process of doing the revision, I've moved the cycle range, and now I have to go back and manually set it again. So yeah, I can see how that can get annoying. But yeah, those little markers, the song end and song start markers, are going to be the way to do that. For your second question, how to add multiple fades all at once, probably the quickest way to add multiple crossfades is to use, if you go up to Key Commands, Edit Assignments, and if you search up crossfade, there's an option here called Apply Default Crossfade. By default, this has a shortcut, and the shortcut is Control-Option-X. And then what you can do is you can drag over as many different audio regions as you like on as many tracks as you like. It can be on different tracks too. And all you do is you drag over those and you hit that Control-Option-X shortcut, and it will automatically add a short crossfade at each of those editing or joining points. The only thing that's tricky is you got to know what the default crossfade length actually is. And in order to check that, you go up to Logic Pro, Settings, Audio, and then from here you go to the Editing tab. And right here, there's a default crossfade time. I set mine to 6 milliseconds, but I think by default it's set to 20 milliseconds. So set this to whatever you want, set whatever default curve you want, and you just use that Control-Option-X shortcut, and it'll automatically apply batch fades to multiple audio regions. Whatever audio regions you have selected, it'll apply that crossfade to. Jonas asks a non-music related question. If the ruling class and elite are wanting to depopulate the world, wouldn't this be counterproductive for them since more people equals more money in their pockets? I don't know. Do I think that there's some sort of like conspiracy to depopulate the earth because there's like the rich want less people in the world? I guess I tend to agree with you. I think rich people who exploit non-rich people probably want more non-rich people in the world to exploit. You know what I mean? But do I think there's some sort of conspiracy theory to depopulate the world? No. Maybe in some other countries, but not here in the US. No, I don't think so. I don't think that's an issue. I think the real issue here is I think there's far less people looking to procreate nowadays, myself included. I'm 37 years old. I don't have a kid. I don't really have any plans on having a kid because, you know, the world is too tough nowadays to raise a family. A lot of people feel that way given the current climate of the world and the climate of the way society is and the way the economy is and the cost of living and how freaking difficult it is to buy a house these days. And like there's a lot of people like struggling to afford housing and just basic necessities. I totally understand why people who are maybe my age, like millennials, late millennials like myself, or even people younger, are opting to wait longer to have kids or are just choosing to not have children because it's just not a priority anymore because it's, you know, it's too difficult. Do I think there's a conspiracy to depopulate the world? No. Do I think more and more younger people are procreating less? Absolutely. And I think it's a result of the society and the economy we live in, not necessarily some, you know, conspiracy to depopulate the earth. Jay Walker says, I know I've said this before, but your videos have literally changed my life by enabling me to become proficient at digital synthesis, and I'm incredibly grateful. Awesome. That's amazing. What do you think it would take to get into scoring or sound design for film or video games? The music production market in general is oversaturated. There's more people trying to get jobs in the industry than there are actual jobs in the industry. And so much of the industry now is self-employment, you know, a gig economy, you know. I would say your best bet is to try to hook up with some indie small-time game producers, some indie filmmakers, or even some student filmmakers. Offer your services for free or at a like reduced rate and try to get your name on a couple of projects. Get a website going, get a demo reel going, post some of these indie projects that you've done on your demo reel and use that as a launching point to sell yourself on your resume on a job application, or just to try to bring in, you know, more work. That's essentially the way I did it. You know, I got into mixing and production work mainly because prior to doing production work, I was just a musician, and I was like, this industry is hard. Like, it's really hard to be a professional musician. And I was like, what am I going to do with this? You know, ultimately, what am I going to be able to, how am I going to be able to pay my bills? And I started doing recording work, and I was like, oh, this actually is like something that people need. And so I did some of my first recording work for free, and I used it to sort of build my demo reel and build my portfolio and my body of work. I got a website going, and I got a social media presence going, and people started coming to me for work. And at first it was smaller projects, and then it started growing into bigger projects, albums, you know. And then I get to the point where I'm charging full price basically all the time because I have the work for it, I have the clients for it, and then your clients start to return to you. So my best advice would be to build a small body of work that you can show that proves and demonstrates your capabilities as a composer. Get involved with some indie projects that have low or no budget or very low budget, and build a demo reel and go from there. I hate to say it, but like, you almost have to have a social media presence nowadays. Like, if you specialize in like cinematic compositions, post them on Instagram, post like short snippets and get people to follow you. And eventually people will start to recognize your content. I heard this track you did. Can you do something similar for me for my short film? You know, that's the best thing I would say you can do, because that's where the majority of my mixing work comes from. It comes from YouTube, because people are like, oh, heard you did this, or I saw you did this, and can you do the same thing for my song? And I'll say, yeah, I probably can. And that's where a lot of my clients come from. So yeah, getting a demo reel out, getting a website presence, getting a social media presence, and just building a small body of work to get started is really the first thing you need to do. Roy says, I'm new to Logic. The new series is perfect timing. My hands became disabled in 2007, and I haven't been able to play guitar since. Is there a good virtual guitar, both electric and acoustic, in Logic or third party? Unfortunately, I can't recommend any Logic plugins for guitar. I mean, bass, like Logic has a ton of great bass patches, but like guitar instruments are really hard to come by in terms of like decent quality ones. However, if you've got the money for it, Contact or Native Instruments has some really nice ones. So yeah, Native Instruments has a few of them. If you're looking for, you have Strummed Acoustic is a really great one. They have 12-string and 6-string instruments. Most of these are like pre-made patterns, but if you're just looking for like rhythm tracks for acoustic guitar, this one's great. Two other ones that are great for acoustic guitar for like individual notes are Picked Nylon for nylon guitar stuff. And then there's also Picked Acoustic, which is like a steel string picked acoustic. As far as electric guitar, you have Electric Sunburst Deluxe, Electric Vintage, and Electric Mint. Electric Sunburst is like basically all done on a Les Paul. Electric Vintage is all done on a Telecaster, I believe. And then Electric Mint is done on a Stratocaster. All extremely high quality guitar instruments. It takes a little bit more work getting used to the key switches and setting up different articulation sets in Logic to use them, but they're very high quality and you can get a really great result out of them. They are a lot of work. It's certainly much easier to just play in the parts and learn the parts yourself. But if you have a disability, you're not able to play anymore, these are great options. Dr. M asks how to get paid for writing songs. That's a tricky question because, like I said before, the market is so saturated. There are so many producers, songwriters, and artists out there, and musicians who are trying to make it and trying to have a livable wage and a livable income because the market is so oversaturated, and the market is also controlled by a very few number of major labels. It's incredibly difficult to get into the industry. I would say if you're like a prolific composer or prolific songwriter or producer, I would say one of the best things you can do right now to start making money off of your compositions is start applying for and submitting your music to commercial music library tracks websites like Epidemic Sound, Soundstripe, places like that, because you can essentially submit your music, and anyone who licenses your music for any reason, you'll get a cut of that. You'll get a cut of that licensing. Small TV programs, for internet programming, for movies, things like that. And then the royalties start to come in. It's definitely a slow process, but it's kind of a surefire way to make money by licensing your tracks. And you still own your tracks. You're just licensing the tracks for use in other media. I would say look at that part of it first, and then maybe branch off once you get established in the industry a bit better. Then try to like branch off into writing music for other people and producing music for other people. TC Films asks, I'm on a 2021 M1 iMac with the max RAM. Lately, I've been getting a system overload and freeze up in Logic Pro with only a few tracks and a plugin or two on each track. It didn't used to happen, and I'm wondering what might be causing it now. Most of the time, I have found that if I'm getting freeze-ups in Logic, it's usually not a Logic problem or an issue with your computer, but rather some sort of an issue with one of the plugins that you're using regularly. Maybe 8 times out of 10, that is the culprit. And it's a pain in the ass because you have to go through and like figure out what plugin is causing the issue and why. Go uninstall that plugin, try to do some work without the plugin, and see if the problem persists. For a long time, I was having an issue with Contact. It was like Contact 5 and 6 being installed at the same time, and it was like corrupting all of my projects and it was all because of this one plugin causing issues. And so once I went and uninstalled that plugin, I didn't have any issues anymore. And there's a few little things you can check as well. Go up to Logic Pro settings, audio, and make sure your buffer size is maxed out. You can also try increasing your processing threads. You can try going with a higher than automatic processing threads. You can try changing the process buffer range to large. You can also try like bringing your summing down to standard precision instead of high precision. Sometimes that'll help, but usually if you're getting like frequent stop ups and frequent freeze ups in Logic, it's usually a plugin that's causing the problem. And if it's not a plugin, it might be that you just need to do a fresh install of Logic, or you need to trash the prefs or trash the PLIST file, as I mentioned in other questions, I'll leave a link to that article below for anyone who's having those sorts of issues. I'll leave it in the video description, and I'll leave it in the comments. And you may also want to check your hard drive space too, because if your hard drive is running low, it can cause like serious performance issues. You Create Your Reality asks or says, why is Logic so unstable? My projects tend to get pretty big, like 100 tracks, but it's glitching and crashing. I've got an M1 Mac, always doing the latest updates. How would you fix it? Any tips, advice? My first tip is not to always do the latest update, because just because there's an update to Logic and just because there's an update to the operating system does not necessarily mean that that's going to make your system run better. Part of the problem is also that you're running 100 tracks and you say you have an M1, but what M1 are you running? If you're running like a MacBook Air or like a Mac Mini that's M1, the cores, the individual cores, as I said in a previous question, are pretty slow. It's possible that you're just maxing out you're just maxing out the processing power of your Mac, even though it is M1. But as Gianni here already responded, you can freeze or bounce your tracks in place. This is a really helpful thing that you can do if you find that you have large projects. Like even here, I have 125 total tracks, if you include all of my, my drum machine designer tracks. And if I've got a track that, is causing issues, or maybe I just want to save some processing power. So in order to freeze tracks, what you can do is you can select any of the tracks, press Option T. This will bring up your track options, and you can turn on the freeze option here. What freeze will do is it'll allow you to freeze the processing of your track in place. So like, for example, let me throw like a plugin on here. Throw like an EQ, make a little change here. And then if you click that button, what it does is it turns green. It gets rid of your input monitor and recording options. And the next time I press play, this is going to essentially freeze that entire track in place. And what it's doing, because this is a software instrument, it's converting the software instrument to audio in place. So you don't actually have to bounce in place. It's doing it automatically for you. You can see that now the instrument is sort of grayed out here. And when I hover over, I get this freeze icon. And then also the effect is grayed out because it's also printed the processed signal with that effect in place. If you go through and you freeze a bunch of your tracks that are software instruments or that have a lot of effects on them, this frees up processing power for other new tracks that you're using in your project. Because essentially this track now is just like playing an audio file, which takes up very little processing power. And then if you want to make a change to the track, you just unfreeze it and you're free to make other changes to it. And if you freeze multiple tracks first, then hit play, it'll freeze them all at once. You don't have to do them one at a time. So that would be my best advice, other than like increasing your buffer size, making sure that you're not like running a bunch of other apps, and also don't update just because there's an update, because sometimes updates can make things work worse. And also, it's the old first thing that Apple always says to do: make a time machine backup of your system so you can always go back, update. If the update is worse for you, then return to your time machine backup. Paulo Alto says, congrats, Josh, and may you quickly have another 600K subs. I hope so. Here are my questions. What are the Logic synths based on? Are they all the same engine with different graphic interface? And my second question, if musicians were to write in the style of some artist, then what about sound design? Is there an education on recreating synth sounds in the style of such and such artist? My last question, of all the soft synths, which ones have the most ability to create the sound of hard synths? Logic synthesizers are not based on other hardware synthesizers. At least most of them aren't. You could make the argument that retro synth is based on like Moog and like some classic like wavetable synths and some classic like FM synths like the DX series from Yamaha, just based on what they look like. But I don't think that the actual programming is anything similar to any hardware synths. when you ask questions about like sound design and how do you know, like when you hear a sound, how do you know what knob to turn? What I would recommend you do is learn and maybe take a course on music synthesis or sound design and synthesis, because when it comes down to it, most synthesizers that are not samplers, they're fundamentally just based on the four main oscillator waveforms: sine wave, triangle wave, square wave, sawtooth. And then you throw other modulation parameters into the mix: filters, ring modulation, frequency modulation, effects, envelopes, ADSRs, LFOs, step sequencers. Creating a sound is not that hard. Creating a sound electrically or in a digital format is not that hard. Sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth, or some variation of those four oscillator waveforms. It's then what you do to the signal after you generate the signal to modulate the signal and make it something more interesting than the original oscillator, the original raw oscillator sound. So I would recommend reading up on or studying sound synthesis, because once you know one synthesizer really well, it makes it really easy to translate that knowledge over to other synthesizers. Like, I have no problem opening up a random synthesizer that I've never seen before and kind of getting an idea and kind of having already an understanding of what's going on, because I already understand what oscillators are, what filters are, what LFOs are, what envelopes are, and how these affect the sound design of an instrument. If you want to learn a thing or two about sound synthesis, I did these 4 videos a long time ago. They're they're in Logic Pro 9, by the way, but they're ES2 synthesizer tutorial parts 1 through 4. I basically break down the entire instrument module by module and explain what each thing is. Once you have an understanding of how oscillators and filters and LFOs and envelopes and modulation routing works in any synthesizer, you can kind of translate these things over to other instruments. And then it also makes it easier for you to figure out, how did that person, how did that artist, how did this producer make that sound? Because you can hear it in your head and you're like, oh, that's a sawtooth with a low pass filter on it, with the resonance pulled up a little bit, and the motion is being created by an LFO, and the pluckiness is being created by pairing an envelope to the pitch of the oscillator. And you start to imagine these sounds in your head as programming in a synthesizer, as knob turning in a synthesizer. So it's kind of like learning to play an instrument, much like learning to learn the fingerings on a clarinet or a saxophone. Learning a synthesizer is learning what each of these little mini devices, these little modules within the synthesizer actually does. Because synthesizers, old school analog synths, don't produce sound any differently back then than they do now. The only difference is now a lot of things are digital, but they're still based on those 4 main oscillator waveforms I was talking about before. But yeah, if you want to like a throwback tutorial that I did a long time ago that might help you out, is this Logic 9 ES2 synthesizer series. Even if you never use the ES2 again after watching this series, the information that's in this will translate well over to other synths. So perhaps I need to make some sort of understanding synthesis tutorial series at some point in the future. Now, if you're specifically looking for synthesizers that model older synthesizers, UVI has just about the best collection of modeled synthesizer instruments out there. This is not sponsored by UVI. I have no affiliation with UVI at this point. I did do some work for them in the past, but I haven't done any work for them in 2 years. Beyond that, they have a bunch of really cool sample-based instruments that are based on older classic hardware synths. They're pretty much the best sounding ones out there. And I do think they have a subscription now, so they're not horribly expensive in terms of great quality, analog modeled synthesizers. UVI has just about the best ones out there, in my opinion, of course. Bonus question: what features is Logic missing that you wish were there? Do you have a roadmap wish list? I mean, the number one thing I as I said before, the number one thing I wish they would improve is flex pitch, or at least just accept the fact that flex pitch sucks and license some other software like Antara's Autotune or Metatune from Slate is really good, or just license Melodyne as a plugin that comes with Logic Pro, like some other DAWs have done. I would also like to see like something similar to the audio suite in Pro Tools, where you can like very easily process audio offline, but within the tracks area. You can kind of do this already. You can go into the track editor, you can pull up your selection based processing, and you can apply things that way. I found it just doesn't work as well as the audio suite does, especially for plugins like Vocal Line, where I use it for mainly for vocal alignment. I can't use this window very well for things like that. I just don't like the way it works. So I'd love to see like a tracks area audio suite function similar to Pro Tools, so I can finally like unsubscribe from Pro Tools and never return to Pro Tools ever again. The Bishi asks, do you worry about your love for music being negatively impacted when you find yourself working on production jobs containing music you privately don't particularly like? Congrats on 300K. Here's to the 1 million mark. Thank you, Sean. Sean from Vancouver. I will say that being a music producer and doing mixing work makes me overly critical about listening to music, kind of in the same way as someone who does like VFX for a living will go watch a movie and you'll be like, oh, that doesn't look right, or the comping on that doesn't look right, or there's always the production element in my head where like I have trouble turning it off sometimes, but it doesn't like affect my enjoyment for music, like I'm not a huge fan of country music, but I've recorded a whole bunch of country bands and I've mixed a bunch of country bands over the years. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because I don't like the music, that it negatively affects my love for music. What I will say is, yes, sometimes when you make music every day for a living by producing other people's music or mixing other people's music, sometimes it does make your writer's block, your own personal writer's block. It's definitely hard sometimes to stay motivated about producing my own music when I'm constantly oversaturated with other people's music. And it's tricky because I don't want to mix so much music that I don't want to make music anymore. You know what I mean? Like that you just get sick of it, and it's no longer fun anymore. It becomes a job, It hasn't gotten to me like that yet. I don't think it will, but there are definitely some times where I'm like, I'll have a day off and I'm like, I really, really, really want to work on some of my own music, but I'm mentally drained. And I think what I found is that I have to find things to do outside of music and music production that I like to do, whether it be like traveling or going on a vacation or like picking up some other hobby. The hobbies I've picked up over the years that are outside of music are home brewing. I like to brew my own beer and I like to smoke meats, like two very unhealthy hobbies, but at the same time, like they get me out of the studio and they get me out of the music world sometimes. And I think that's part of it too. You have to like decompress your brain sometimes, and you have to step away from things that you love, because if you get oversaturated by them, yeah, you can lose interest in them. But I know other people who they're so into it. Like I'm like, how do you keep your motivation for this? Because at the end of the day, I just want to sit down and watch TV and crack open a beer and relax most days. I don't usually have the energy to go produce my own track after mixing someone else all day long. I just don't have the patience for it anymore, or the motivation for it anymore. So yeah, I think as long as you try to find another hobby in life outside of music, it gives you something else to it helps you decompress from the music and music production side of things. And it sort of clears your head. And then when you come back to it and you revisit your own music, you kind of have a fresh perspective. Your head is clear. You're not stressed out. You're not overwhelmed. So sometimes taking a break from it is a good thing, and maybe focusing on some other hobby or some other, healthy habit like exercising, or, I probably should be doing more exercising than home brewing at this point. But yeah, just, take a break from it, decompress your brain, come back with a fresh view, fresh ears, a fresh mind, a fresh perspective. And I think that'll help out a lot. Matt V says, congratulations, Josh. I remember finding you right after you started this channel. You've been such an inspiration and help in my understanding. Thank you. I would like to know how you manage your audio and MIDI I/O, especially with your outboard gear. Thanks so much to your contribution to the community. So this is a similar question to before. I use the I/O plugin for my hardware inserts, and I use a patch bay to patch everything up. So it's like I said before, if you have more hardware I/O than you have channels on your audio interface, you need to buy a patch bay. If you have less hardware I/O than you do channels on your audio interface, you can just wire everything hardwired and call it a day. But I bought a cheap used TT patch bay. I soldered up everything on the back myself. It was a complete pain in the ass, and I would recommend, if you have the money, just go with like a DB25 patch bay and spend the extra money on DB25 to XLR cables. And essentially the concept is you take every input and output on your interface, add them to the patch bay. You take every input and output on all of your hardware, add that to the patch bay, add any other IO, like, for your monitor controller, your headphone amp, things like that. Add any input or output you have in your system to the patch bay, and therefore you can connect anything to anything. If I want to connect my Portico to channel 7 and 8, I can do that. If I want to connect it to channel 1 and 2, I can do that. If I want to connect my, headphone output to output 8, I can do that. So it's just a matter of patching it in. It does get expensive though. Patch bays are not cheap. The cheapest new TT Bantam patch bay you're going to find out there is like $1,000 at least, maybe slightly under $1,000. Used ones, you can find them, for like $200 or $300, but most of those are going to be point-to-point patch bays. And there was a cool website where I found mine. It's called MrPatchBay.com, and Mr. Patch Bay has a whole bunch of links to different used and new patch bays of all different types. And this is where I got mine. So there's a bunch of used ones on here for not a horrible price, definitely cheaper than the $1,000 starting price you'll see for most new ones. I think this is the one I have in my home studio, this ADC 96 point TT. You have to solder all the points in the back, but you can get one for like $200 basically. Or go cheap and get a TRS patch bay. There's no difference in sound quality between TRS and TT. It's just a matter of how many points can you fit on the front and back of the unit. What I used to do is I had a couple of TRS patch bays, and everything was hooked up by TRS in the back, and then all of the patches were TRS in the front. It just takes up a bit more space in the rack. Victor Sanchez is back again, and this time he's asking, in your opinion, which is the best Logic Pro MIDI controller? MIDI controllers are inherently generic. Most of them are. I would say that there isn't a best controller, but the one that I use a lot for at least like playing in music is this one right up here. You can see it in the background. This is a Novation Launchpad Pro. That's the Pro, the Mark II or Mark III. I think it's the Mark III model. You plug it in, it automatically syncs up. You can use it to control live loops if you're working in live loops. You can use it to trigger cells in live loops, or you can use it just as a beat pad style controller. So I love this one if you're not a keyboard player. If you're a keyboard player, really any keyboard MIDI controller will do. I use a launch key. I use a launch key 61 when I'm playing in piano stuff. I have this cheap little Alesis V25 that I use just for chord entry and just, basic beat building. So there really isn't a best MIDI controller for Logic Pro. It's a matter of what MIDI controller has the options that you need. But I personally don't like MIDI controllers that have a bunch of whistles and bells. I actually prefer them to be more generic. But if you're looking to work with live loops, the Novation Launchpad is incredible for that. So I have two people that ask questions about an Akai MPK Mini and having issues loading software instruments that come with those MIDI controllers. So Rick Francis says, "Hi, tech guy. First of all, thank you. You have a generous heart and wealth of knowledge. Thank you. So many questions. One is, I got the Akai MPK Mini Mark III controller along with having installed the free software instruments. Now, how do I see these Velvet sounds, etc., in my Logic library to access them?" And then this next person also asks, I have installed M Audio Oxygen Mini Grand plugin, able to record but not able to play or hear. I don't know if these folks are loading the instrument up properly, but in Logic, you'll have to, just create a new software instrument. On that software instrument, you're going to have to click here on the instrument tab. And at the very bottom, you're going to go to UA instrument or AU instruments, and you'll see those instruments load up here as long as you installed them. And you should be able to load them up just like any other software instrument, unless, of course, these included instruments are not AU component compatible. It's very likely that these might just be Pro Tools and VST plugins. Here we go. Akai Professional MPK Mini Mark III. Yeah, here it comes. It comes with 6 amazing virtual instruments: Bassline, Tube Synth, Electric, Hybrid 3, Mini Grand, and Velvet. So these are the two that these two folks were asking about. The question is, what format are these instruments in? Because if they're not in AU component format, you won't be able to use them in Logic. If they're just VST, you're not going to be able to use them in Logic. If they're just AAX plugins for Pro Tools, not going to be able to use them with Logic. So let's see here. As long as you've installed the audio unit version of these plugins, if they are available in that format, which I think they are, you should be able to just load them up on a new software instrument, just like I demonstrated before, and they should work. A lot of people especially beginners, get confused about MIDI controllers, thinking that the sounds are in the instrument. They're not. The controller is just a controller. The sounds are on your computer. So in order to use those instruments, you have to load them up in the DAW on a software instrument track. There's also the possibility that the plugins that were included with that MIDI controller are not compatible with your operating system. Maybe you're on Ventura or one of the newer Mac OSs, and maybe those plugin manufacturers haven't caught up to that operating system yet. But yeah, if you don't see them by going down to AU Instruments, and then it'll probably say Air Music Technology, find the Air Music Technology folder, and then load up that instrument. If you don't see them there, then chances are that the plugins are not compatible with your operating system currently, or you haven't installed the audio unit component version of those plugins. Dr. M says, you're doing a great job. Can you make some videos on music business, on how to publish music, and all about music marketing, and bring music theory series? Thanks. I could do videos on like music publishing because I know how to do that. Like distribution and publishing are not anything complicated. The music business itself, I am the last person you want to talk to. Like I'm the one who's making the records sound good and passing them off to the artist, who then does whatever they want to do with them. You know, their manager, their promotion team does whatever they want to do with it. So I'm probably not the person you want talking about the music industry and the music business in terms of like how marketing works and how all these things work. I'm horrible even like on my own YouTube channel, I'm horrible at marketing myself. Music theory, I can help you there. I do have plans eventually at some point in the future of like redoing my entire music theory series, making like maybe 2 different series, like a music fundamentals course and then doing like a music theory course, but do it from the perspective of a music producer, not necessarily like the music staff. Like sure, we'll look a little bit at the music staff and notes are on the staff and all that stuff, but even as someone who went through like 7 years of college, took multiple music theory and arrangement courses in my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, I think that music theory can be taught in a way for music production that is specific to music production while still covering all of the nuance of the like the formality of music. Because you know there are some people who will say that you don't need any music theory to be a songwriter or a producer, and while that is true, you're just making life really hard on yourself. Like, can you design a building without knowing advanced like mathematics that like an architect would know? Sure, you can, but it's going to make the job a hell of a lot more difficult. So why make it difficult on yourself if you can just learn the fundamentals of music and have that ingrained in your brain like a second language? So yeah, I definitely am on the side of it's best if you learn the fundamentals of music, because it makes getting ideas out of your head and onto Logic or onto your sonic platform much easier to do when you know what you're playing over here and you understand the physics of what's happening between the different frequencies and the different intervals and all these different things. So yeah, I'm definitely thinking about rebooting the Theory series, but probably not anytime like very soon. It'll probably be a little bit later once I've gotten pretty deep into the ultimate guide. AJ Weber says, I know you're making Logic videos right now. Think we will see another Josh pulls out all of the bells and whistles where you get to be as fearlessly creative as you want and we get to reap the benefit of watching you create. Absolutely. At some point, I'm going to do some more videos where I just start from scratch and I build a song from beginning to end and show you the entire production process without limiting myself to certain plugins, without limiting myself to certain instruments, and just creating as I normally do. I certainly do. I have a whole new like electronic music project I'm going to be putting out at some point here, and I'm starting to work on these tracks, and that's definitely something I have in mind for the future. Vivid William asks, what are your thoughts on the convergence of Web3 and music, specifically using NFTs as a music distribution or marketing mechanism? So this is a tough topic because I don't know a whole lot about NFTs. I mean, I know what an NFT is. Well, first of all, let's go back to Web3. Web3 is sort of like a concept of a new iteration of the internet. And again, I'm not really well researched on this or anything. This is just my rough, uncut thoughts. But a concept of a new iteration of the internet. So you could say maybe we're in Web 2.0 right now, where the internet is more decentralized rather than being centralized. Because right now it seems like a very small group of very wealthy corporations and individuals own the vast majority of space on the internet, or really own, the resources that are on the internet. And decentralizing that and making it more of like a public works thing certainly seems like a good idea, but I think there's a lot of like issues we have to think about. In terms of music and music distribution and using NFTs as a music distribution tool, I think it could be a good idea. There's this concept that you finish let's say you finish a track or a project. It could be an EP, it could be a single song, and you make that an NFT that you can then sell or split up into pieces. Or maybe on a more grand scale, you're streaming it, but instead of like Spotify paying you less than a penny for it when you stream the song, you're I guess licensing it for your own use to listen to. I see the value in that, especially because the music streaming services are kind of a ripoff for indie musicians, and it's not just Spotify anymore. Pretty much every single streaming service is paying like less than a penny per stream. Like I looked it up, my band is getting paid like 0.0038 US dollars per stream roughly from Spotify. Like that's like on average. So like let's say you had 10,000 streams, that's like $38 for 10,000 streams. You'd have to have a million streams a month to bring in $3,800 a month to have like some sort of income that's even remotely close to like a livable wage. Now, I'm not saying everyone can make it as a musician. There's more to it than just, oh, I put out music, therefore I expect someone to buy my product. No, that's not how it works. But I think that the idea that we can keep going down this path where Spotify and other streaming platforms basically are exploiting free labor from musicians who are selling their product, but willingly selling their product and getting pennies in return for it. It's dangerous because I think it could ultimately completely unravel and destroy the indie music industry, which I would like to see more of the indie music industry and less of the mainstream personally. So, this idea that you can make your masters like NFTs and then you're distributing your masters or distributing your records as, people buying tokens of an NFT seems like a good idea. The problem is every single time I hear anyone talk about NFTs, crypto comes up. And it's like, to me, cryptocurrency, like regardless of like what its original intent was, seems kind of like a scam to me, because the way crypto is used, especially now, and it's like sort of like a pump and dump scheme where it's like, the rich people get on it early, invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into it. It grows like a stock would, and then everyone sells all of their shares. Like average people like you and me end up just losing money on the deal. So I don't really see cryptocurrency as like a valid way to pay people or, you know, to distribute music. Like if I had to get paid in crypto, I just wouldn't do it, you know? So it's like, in a lot of ways, it's like any other business. You have to find a way to bring people to you and pay for your service, or, you know, even if your service is, here's my music. You know, I have, like I said before, I have an electronic project I'm working on, and I'm considering not even releasing it on Spotify or Apple Music and just putting it on YouTube Music, and that's it. The amount of advertising revenue I can get from ads on YouTube is significantly higher than the 0.0038 cents per stream, less than a penny per stream, or third of a penny per stream that I would get on Spotify or any streaming platform. I'm open to it, but I don't know enough about it. So that's the short answer. I'm open to it, but I don't know enough about it to really have a well thought out opinion. John Bond says, congratulations, I stumbled on your videos and I love them all. I'm new to making music in a DAW, but I have a history in music theory and choral music. My goal is to be an artist that produces my own tracks. I spend a lot of time working and tinkering with chord progression apps while I'm at work. But other than that, and watching YouTube videos, do you have any good suggestions on what I can do to help me with my process when I'm not actually in Logic practicing? The number one thing I ever did for myself that helped me to like internalize music in my head was sitting down at the piano or MIDI controller, practicing scales and chords. I know it's the most boring thing, but when you play C minor and improvise in C minor for a certain amount of time, your brain starts to internalize C minor. Your hands start to internalize C minor. There's like a connection that's built, and you're like, okay, I now know all of the chords and possible like common chord progressions in C minor. Now it's very easy for me to just sit down at any keyboard instrument or any piano and come up with a chord progression. Now, I'm not saying I'm like, you know, Desmond Child. I'm not like some amazing songwriter, but I can come up with musical ideas very quickly because of all these years of practicing in the practice room in college and learning all of my scales and learning all of my chords. You know, it's not just rudiments and like forcing you to like do something just to do it for the formality of it. It's about attaching these ideas in your head to things that you can physically do at an instrument or in a DAW. And that's why I think that's the number one thing you can do, is just to practice your scales and chords, not to be good at scales and chords, but rather to use them as a tool for composing. Now, if you don't have like an instrument in front of you, like if you don't have a piano sitting in your living room or like a keyboard in your living room or a guitar, like it's kind of tough because you have to have some way to, like I said, to take those ideas in your head and connect them to something physical. Because if you can't physically practice it, your brain's not gonna make those connections. So like using an app, you know, helps. But like in terms of like actually getting to, you know, to build those connections in my brain. Joe Ragaseo says, I'm fairly new to Logic. What would be the best way to record section at a time? I don't want to use cycle recording. I'm trying to play in drums one at a time on a keyboard and would like to add them one at a time in small sections. Okay, so I'm assuming you're using a MIDI controller and you're trying to trigger sounds within your DAW. Your best bet is to just create a software instrument and then load up whatever drum instrument you want to work with. I'll use, I'll use a drum machine designer kit here, just as an example. And then go up to Logic Pro settings or preferences, go to recording. And from here, under overlapping track recordings from MIDI, for cycle off and cycle on, set this to merge. Because then what you can do is you can just play in each kit piece one at a time. So like if I want to do kick first. Right, start with a kick. Let me turn that metronome way down. That's an awfully loud metronome sound. And then maybe I want to move on to the snare or the clap or something like that. And then maybe I want to move on to the hi-hat. You'll see it just overlaps and merges all of those MIDI recordings in a single MIDI region. Now, my timing was way off there because I've got a screen capture running, which makes the latency completely horrible, but you could quantize these. Maybe I'll just quantize these to like an eighth note. And now I've got a beat. And you can split this up into as many layers as you want. You can do it in as short of a section as you want. 1 bar at a time, 2 bar at a time, 8 bars at a time. SP asks, is there a way to record in Logic without creating take folders or new tracks like in Pro Tools? Yes, there absolutely is a way you can do this. You can do this with track alternatives. I'll pull up an audio track just to kind of show you this since I have my mic hooked up here. So I'll just call this voice. And I'll set my input here, input 1. I'm going to mute the track just so, you know, there's not a bunch of interference and feedback and things like that. So you can see I'm getting signal. If I hit R to record, check testing 1 2, check 1 2, check testing 1 2, check testing 1 2. Okay, so I just made a single track recording. If I were to record right on top of this, by default, Logic's going to create a take folder. If you don't want to use take folders, you can use track alternatives. So you can go up to track, select show track alternatives. I believe you can do this by selecting the track and pressing Option T. You can show your track alternatives here as well. Then what you do after showing your track alternatives is you click here. You'll see this extra little option next to the name of the track, and you select new, or you can just remember the shortcut Control Option Command N. So Control Option Command N will create a new, kind of like a playlist, kind of like in Pro Tools. You record another take, check testing 1 2, check testing 1 2 3. Stop the recording, and now you can just click here and you can switch between your different takes. So you can take 1, take 2, and just all the way up the list. They're just stored as take A, B, C, D, and so forth and so on. And then you can delete takes that you don't want to use. You can duplicate takes. You can rename the takes. You can call them other things. You can be like, you know, call this bad take 1. And then I could rename maybe A as good take 1, you know, so you can name these as different, different descriptive things. So yeah, I mean, that's one way to do it. You know, like if you need to get rid of, let's say I need to get rid of bad take 1, you just delete that. And then what you do is you just select, you go back to another take like A here, and then you select delete inactive, and it'll delete that inactive take with nothing on it. So that's a way to do it if you hate take folders. I love take folders, I really do. But this is kind of like similar to the way like Pro Tools does it with playlists, except you can't open up the playlist and see all of them in there. They're just stored within the track alternatives. Real Pool says, congrats, I've been watching since 2014. Can you touch on setting up and mixing with reference tracks? Would love to see your process. Keep up the quality work. To be completely honest with you, I don't use reference tracks that often unless an artist is like specifically like, I love this artist, I want to sound like this person. I'm like, okay, I can try to get your mix, you know, as close as possible to that, which is often difficult, you know, and you're not going to sound like Jimi Hendrix unless you play like Jimi Hendrix and you have the same guitar and amp as Jimi Hendrix and the same vibe and atmosphere as Jimi Hendrix, with the same microphones and the same recording studios. There's a lot that goes into it, you know. It's not just like, I want to sound like that. You can kind of mimic the tone a bit, but you're never going to get 100% there. When it comes to like mastering though, sometimes people will be like, you know, I really like the frequency balance of this song by this artist. And what I'll do is I'll drop in, here, I'll pull up a track here. Okay, so like one way I might use this for mastering, like using a reference like EQ curve, is to use the match EQ in Logic. So let's say like, here's a fully mastered track. Here's one that I'm working on, and I want to make this one have more of the tone of this one. This is also helpful when you're trying to master multiple songs for the same record, for the same EP or the same album. I'm not going to play any of these tracks because I don't want to get copyright claimed. But what you do is you load up the match EQ on the reference track that you're working on. So actually, I'll just load it on the stereo out here. And then what you do is you play the reference, click on reference here, hit learn, mute the original, just play the reference track. So it's going to learn the frequency balance and the frequency curve for that song. And then, you know, I let it play for 30 or 40 seconds, stop it, turn off learn, And then I'm going to mute the reference channel, bring up my mix, and then I'm going to go to current and click learn and play a bit of this track. Again, trying to play like 30 or 40 seconds, like a significant portion of it. What you end up with is a frequency curve for your song, a reference curve from your reference track, and you can click match, and it will attempt to match the tone of your track to the tone of the reference track. I almost never go 100%. It's usually like a small adjustment, and I usually turn the smoothing down because I like to get all these little nooks and crannies in here. And you can also adjust the extremes, like sometimes the bass isn't right, so you can fade in the bass frequencies, just like so. Sometimes you can need to fade in the top end, and it's like more of like the mid range, like the area that you're going to hear the most, and the tone matching that you're going to hear the most is between this like 1 to 5K range. So it's not always 100% necessary for the bass and the treble to be 100% there, because depending on the key of the song, the register of the song, what type of bass instruments being used, you may get a completely different bass response. And then especially for like the top end, it's like how much cymbals are in it, how many bright shakers and other percussive elements are there. So there's a lot of other factors here, but the match EQ is a great way to take a reference curve, apply it to your current mix or master, and then create a match EQ curve that maybe pushes your mix 5 or 10% more in the direction of that person's mix or that artist's mix or master. And you can sort of impose or impart some of the tone of that master on your own. But when you do use it, I highly recommend only using it a little bit. Like, you don't want to be making these drastic cuts like this. That's just going to completely destroy the frequency balance of your mix. What I usually tell people is, like, when I mix your song, when I master your song, I'm not trying to sound like someone else. I think that that's inherently a bad thing already. Like, oh, I want to sound like Led Zeppelin, or I want to sound like Metallica. Well, okay, do you really want to sound like Led Zeppelin and Metallica? Or do you want to take your music as it is and work to your own music's strengths? Because by trying to sound like someone else, by trying to do too much referencing, what I find is that artists often lose their own creative identity because they're almost trying too hard to sound like someone else. I know other people mix and master to references all the time. That's not me. I like to work within the confines of the song that I'm given, and I try to work to the song's natural strengths. Max B says, I'm always waiting for your videos, and each time it's great. What about remaking a song start to finish? Thanks for all things, and keep your way along. Sorry. Oh, sorry for my English, Max. Thanks, Max. Yeah, kind of like I mentioned before, I do plan on doing like a beginning to finish, start to finish, like song composition and production, and kind of walk you through the whole production process, including recording, bringing in vocalists. That's definitely something I have, on the table for the future. Remaking other people's songs, like a song dissection. I think there's many other channels on YouTube that probably could do that better than me, and that are already out there doing that better than me, like doing beat breakdowns. To be honest with you, I'm not really interested in doing beat breakdowns. I'm more interested in let's build a new original song from scratch, instead of trying to dissect what someone else is trying to do. It kind of goes on the topic of the previous question that I answered, is like, I would much rather see a new, young, fresh, independent artist come out and do something that sounds very original and has its own unique flavor to it, rather than being like, oh, this person is trying to be like such and such artist, and they're doing a very good job at sounding like this artist. Like, there's nothing wrong with like drawing influences from other artists, for sure, but like, I would much rather someone come out and do their own thing and kind of ignore, I hate to say ignore, but ignore what's going on in the industry in order to spark their own creative sound, than to have someone closely follow or dissect songs that are currently popular in the market and try to copy that sound. But I completely understand from like a money making perspective, like, if a certain sound is hot and a certain sound is popular right now, you have to follow that. You have to latch onto it. So it's kind of this, this balance of like what do I want to do versus what is popular in the industry at the moment. So I completely understand that there's this balance here, but there's so much imaginative and creative electronic music, especially indie electronic music out there right now. I mean, there's still a lot of room to grow, I think, in electronic music and in popular music. I just think a lot of the same sounding artists are out there right now. I recently listened to like the top 20 or top 40 pop charts fairly recently. It was last year, and I was like shocked at how basic most of the songs were. And I'm like, where's the interesting sound design? Where's the cool vocal performances? They're not there anymore because what's popular in the industry right now is, in my opinion, pretty basic. I would love to see more experimentation with new tones and new instruments and new sound design and new technologies, not just rehashing more of the same thing. But I also completely understand that music for most people is just for consumption, to listen to in the background, to work out to listen to in your drive to work, not necessarily like people sitting down and really like appreciating the artistic endeavor that the producer or that the artist put forth. I think that sort of respect for music is something that's more in the indie industry, more so than the mainstream industry. Derek Gillard asks, when removing tempo information from several audio tracks at once, Logic will ask me to confirm for each track. Is there a way that Logic can apply the same answer to every track so I'm not pushing confirm several times depending on how many tracks? Oh, yeah, I wish they would fix this. So what he's talking about is when you have like multiple audio files that you're importing that have tempo information in them, you can add the tempo information to them by right-clicking or control-clicking and going to tempo, write project tempo to audio file. But the problem is, like when you drag these in, it's gonna remember that tempo information. If you want to forget that or remove that tempo information, you then have to right-click on these again and go to remove tempo information. What it's going to make you do is click OK or hit return for every single region that's here. And unfortunately, there is no like modifier key. I tried all of them. I tried Command, Option, Control, Shift, all four of them at the same time. It's still going to make you click that OK button every time. So unfortunately, right now, there is no way to sort of globally turn off all of those little dialogues that pop up. You're just going to have to sit there and hit enter or return until all of them are accounted for, at least for now. Hopefully that's something they add in a future update. I do know that if you're exporting files and you don't want to tag the tempo information, you can now do that in the newer versions of Logic. So if I'm exporting multiple tracks like this, like if I go to export all tracks as audio files, there's an option here now to include or not include tempo information. So if you don't want tempo information written to tracks that you're exporting in the first place, you can just not check that option and it will not include the tempo information. Shali Badra says, congratulations, sir. I have a question that how to import Rex or Rx2 format files or samples on Logic Pro latest version. I think what you're saying is how can you import Rex files? It has been at least 8 years, I think, since I've used Recycle and Rex. So if you're not familiar with the Rex format, these are associated with an application called Recycle from Propellerhead, the people who make Reason. Recycle was kind of a cool app, standalone sample app, because what you could do is you could load in audio and Recycle would like pre-tag the audio file with like notes and slice points and things like that. So then when you load these Rex files or RX files, .rx, I think they're .rx2 files now, into a sampler that supports Rex files, all of the sample programming would be done for you in advance. So you're not sitting here trying to have to, manually map your own sample instrument. I'm fairly certain, I'm not 100% sure, that Logic got rid of their Rex compatibility, at least for loading into the sampler instrument. I'm fairly certain that when they switched from EXS24 over to sampler, that they got rid of the Rex compatibility, because there used to be an option in the EXS24 where you could import Rex files. Like, I don't even see the option here anymore. Like, if I go to the mapping or the zone section, I don't even see an option. No audio file loaded, load new. Yeah, there's like no option for Rex files. Yeah, it doesn't even give an option for it. I think just importing Rex files into Logic is still possible, but I don't think you can import or export them from Sampler anymore, because I think they removed that feature from Sampler when they went from the EXS24 over to Sampler. I believe Rex files, though, if you have an audio track pulled up, someone will have to try this out. If you have an audio track pulled up and the audio track is selected, and you just go up to File, Import Audio File, I believe you can still select Rex files this way, and they'll still import onto the timeline as audio, but I do not believe that you can load Rex files into Sampler anymore. And to be honest, like, this was one of those questions I looked up in advance because I wasn't sure, and I tried to find some Rex files, and I can't even find free Rex files. Like, virtually every website that used to put out Rex samples is like shut down. Like, the latest version of Recycle from Propellerhead is like not compatible with Mojave and higher. So that's how old this is. So I honestly think that most people have abandoned the Rex format just because there's not much of a need for it anymore. Although I do completely understand the sort of intercompatibility that Rex files give you between different sampler instruments. And like I said, I used to use them myself, but I think it's been 7 or 8 years since I've even used Recycle or Rex files. So it's been a while. Manerai66TW asks, is there a safe way, I'm assuming, of working long hours with Logic? I mainly use headphones, and lately my hearing test showed mild issues, and I don't know if this is just something that comes with age, or perhaps there are some rules within music production of how to work safely that I'm not aware of. Great question. I mix at relatively low levels in terms of where my monitor controller is set. I try not to mix for longer than like 5 hours in a day, because I start to get that cotton ears feeling where like everything kind of sounds mushy, and like I get to a certain point by the end of the day where like frankly everything just sounds like shit, and I just stop because it's not worth it to keep mixing and mixing and mixing on bad ears. I'd rather work on something else, maybe move on to some editing work instead of mixing work, and then wake up the next morning with a fresh set of ears and a fresh perspective. Like, I would say that mixing on headphones with the headphones set relatively high is going to be damaging on your ears, because you got a driver right next to your ear for hours on end. I almost never mix on headphones. Like, I reference on headphones, but I mix on speakers because I can control the volume here relatively easily, and there's not a driver right in front of my ear. In terms of like how you can damage your hearing, again, I'm no doctor, but I just know from experience that you're not supposed to expose yourself to sound pressure levels of 90 dB or higher for long-term periods of time. If you're constantly in an environment where you're hearing 90 dB and higher continually, they recommend hearing protection. So, I would say mix at a lower level. That's one element to it, and get used to mixing at a lower level. Even now at 37, I still have pretty good hearing, but I definitely like the top end of my hearing is a little lower than it used to be when I was in my 20s. I think my ears are still fine. I don't have any problem hearing anything, and my clients are generally still happy with my mixes. But as you get older, the top end of your hearing does come down a bit. Typically by age 50, most people can only hear up to about 10 or 12,000 hertz, or at least with any like fidelity. And that's totally normal. And that doesn't mean that once you hit 50, you can't mix anymore. It just means that you have to be cognizant of that, and maybe run your mixes by other people, maybe some younger people who are able to, give them a listen and give you their subjective opinion of what the mix sounds like. So it's really a twofold thing. One, not listening to too many loud sound sources continuously, in particular trying to keep things lower than 90 dB, and two, accepting the fact that as you age, your top end gets lower and lower, and that's because there's these little hairs inside the cochlea inside of your ear, and over time these little sensory hairs, they fall down. They're little sensory cells, or they're cell clusters, I guess. They fall down, and the more these little cells fall down, they don't regrow. They're just dead, and so they no longer sense sound in the cochlea, and it affects the top end more so than the bottom end. So you just have to be cognizant of the top end. That, as you age, you may be more and more likely to add top end because you're not hearing the top end in your mixes because of your age. So I don't know what age you are, but at 20, it's at 20, I could hear up to like 18,000 hertz. Now at 37, I can hear up to about 16,000 hertz, 16 and a half. And that's where it just kind of cuts off for me. The older you get, the lower that threshold gets. And there's really no way around it other than just taking care of your ears. When you go out in public, like, bring musicians' earplugs with you. When you're going to be in a loud situation, bring musicians' earplugs with you, because you can still hear what's going on, but you're not exposing yourself to like higher than 90 dB sound pressure levels for any extended period of time. I spent so much of my life in clubs in my 20s playing with bands and being around loud music that I always worry about my hearing and having, issues with my hearing. Fortunately enough, I don't, but I do get every once in a while, I'll get like a foggy ear, and it just takes a few hours to work its way out. Or I'll get like tinnitus or tinnitus, and I'll just get like a ringing in my ear sometimes just from, playing in clubs all the time. If you're young and you're watching this, be very, 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 very careful about your ears, because if you listen to loud music too long, and I know I'm just sounding like your parents, or I'm sounding like an old guy here, but if you listen to loud volumes for extended periods of time, you will trash your hearing, and it can result in you not being able to mix or produce anymore, at least not able to be able to produce at the level that you'd want to, or you'd have to get some sort of really, really specialized, really expensive hearing aids in order to do so. Second question is mixing and mastering. I realize that some engineers charge separately for these two, while I always thought this was just a final one stage in which you set up the levels and frequency quality of the complete musical composition. So a ready project in which you don't add or take any sounds or plugins, but only emphasize or filter certain waves. Can you explain how separate these two things are? Wishing you and followers a lot of success and peace in 2023. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, when I mix and master, I do it kind of at the same time. I'll be completely honest. Like, I will usually pull up the Portico on my master out. I'm getting the mix about 80% there first. Then I'll start throwing in the Portico. I'll throw in like ozone. I'm not throwing in the final limiter yet. And I'll start toying with some of those frequencies, and I'll see how those affect the mix. And then I'll tweak the mix a little bit. And then I'll go back to the master and tweak the master a bit until they sort of come together. And then once I've got the tonal balance and the width and everything I want, then I add the final limiter and dial in that final limiter setting. That's the very last thing I do. So that's how it works for me. I have been told, and I have experienced this firsthand, that typically if you mix a project and you allow someone else to master it, you will end up with a better result. Or if you co-master it with someone, the reality is that most indie artists, and most of my clients are indie artists, don't have the ability to do that, because you're going to have to pay me or a mixing engineer several $100s to mix the track. Then you're going to have to send it off to another mastering engineer who you're also going to have to pay a decent chunk of money to master and to really hone in on the mastering. I would say those situations are only worth it if you're doing like an entire like EP or album release and you've got some marketing behind it and you're really concerned about making sure that the quality is 110% there. If it's like an indie project and it's a single, just mix and master at the same time, because then you're mastering the song to the song. You're not having to master your song to a reference or to another track that's on the EP or the album. So when I turn in finished mixes to my clients, they're almost always hearing the master effects on the chain as well. And then, I'll go back and do 2, 3, and 2 or 3 revisions, and I may tweak the mix and the master at the same time. It's rare now that I used to do it this way, but it's rare now that I mix a whole project and then we move on to mastering. Usually that only happens when there's like a larger project, like a full album happening, where I'm bringing in like another mastering engineer or another set of ears, or maybe if I'm mastering to tape or something, which is very rare these days. So yeah, I don't think of it that way. I definitely think of it as a 2-stage process. I'm starting the mastering before I'm completely finished with the mixing. Let's put it that way. Dr. M again, will you make tutorials on genres like EDM producing and vocal production, like artists like The Weeknd? Again, not like any specific artist, more generic, but yes, I do plan on putting out some courses and some shorter format things like 20-part courses where we focus on certain elements of production. I like to keep things open-ended because I really, as I've said in other questions, I hate the idea of people trying to sound like someone else. I would rather you just sound like yourself and work to your play to your strengths. So when I do tutorials, my general approach is I'm going to show you how to do things in a generic sense, and you can decide for yourself what direction you want to take it in. So I definitely have plans for like a synthesis course, a new music theory course, the drum building course that was a previous question is a great idea too. Electronic music is so diverse nowadays too. Like even the term EDM is a dated term by today's standards. So, it's hard to say like, hey, I want to produce in a specific style anymore it's hard to say I want to do a course in a specific genre anymore because electronic music is so diverse. I can barely tell the difference between 2 different electronic genres nowadays. Usually it comes down to, is there a 4 on the floor or is there some sort of more broken beat or trap sound? That's what I hear. I'm like, okay, I hear a trap sound, I hear a broken beat sound, and I hear a 4 on the floor sound. And that's what distinguishes the genre for me, not necessarily the production techniques. Because, prior to electronic music, it was the instrumentation really, and the way the instruments were played that produces the genre. You can't have rock and roll without drums, bass, and guitar. You can't have disco without a 4 on the floor beat. You can't have house music without a 4 on the floor beat. You can't have trance music without big risers and uplifting sections and breakdown sections. So it's becoming harder and harder for me to draw like distinct lines between different genres of music these days, which makes it difficult to do a course that's hones in on a specific style of music. But yes, I do plan on doing some courses and tutorials in the future that are more genre specific. Sten says, congrats on the milestone. Here's a question. How come so many third-party plugins don't work in Logic? Is there an easy way of telling if a plugin is going to work with Logic before purchasing it? The main thing you got to look out for is that there are 3 main plugin formats. You have AU component format. So AU stands for audio unit, but the actual files are .component files. These are specifically for Mac applications, and not all Mac applications. Like Logic uses them, all of Logic's apps will use them. Mainstage uses them. Studio One can use them. I believe, Ableton Live can use them. And then you have VST, which is like the most like generic open source plugin format. VST is Cubase, it's Studio One, it's Ableton Live, it's Reaper, but Logic does not support VSTs. If you install a VST plugin, it's not going to work in Logic. It won't even show up. And then you have AAX plugins, which are like the Avid Pro Tools format, also will not work in anything other than Pro Tools or other Avid apps. So that's the first thing you have to make sure you're doing, making sure that you're installing the correct version of a plugin, because if a plugin, especially a lot of the free ones, are all VST, a lot of the free ones are not AAX, a lot of the free ones are not AU components. So if it's not the correct format, it's not going to work in Logic. That's reason number 1. The second reason is because Apple updates their software so much that sometimes the plugin manufacturers can't keep up with the OS updates and the Logic updates. It's rare that a plugin won't work in a new version of Logic. It's not that uncommon that a plugin won't work in a new operating system, especially if it's an older plugin that's 32-bit and the plugin manufacturer hasn't updated it for 64-bit yet. Most of the big manufacturers, Waves, Native Instruments, UVI, Antares, Universal Audio, I'm sure I'm leaving some others out, Slate, the big boys, the big companies, they're on top of this typically. I've had Isotope. I've had no issue with big time plugins, big name plugins working on my system, even on Ventura. I have more problems with Ventura itself than compatibility with Ventura. Yeah, it's usually that. It's usually 32-bit issues, or you just don't, it's, you know, the plugin you're trying to install isn't in AU component format. Crimson Explorer says, Josh, congratulations. Been watching since 2015 when I started producing, and I've learned so much from you. That's awesome. Thank you. I had a question for the Q&A, but it would be cool to see it in the video. One, I've recently upgraded laptops, and I'm sure a lot of music makers also face this issue. How can we transfer not just our plugins, but our customized presets, channel strip settings, custom templates, and custom loops saved in the loop browser? There's a lot to unpack here. To transfer your plugins is going to be tricky. You can do just a time machine backup, and when you go to another computer, it'll transfer all of your plugins over. The problem, sometimes the authenticators for the plugins are different, right? Some plugin companies, you can just open up the plugin, enter your serial number, you're done. Other plugins, you have to have an iLocker, you have to use iLock. Other companies, you have to use their own, authenticator. What I recommend doing when going from one computer to another is just simply reinstalling all of your plugins. I know it's the most pain in the ass way to do it. It's the slowest way to do it. That's the best way to do it because one, you're getting a fresh, compatible install of every single plugin, and two, you're taking care of all of your authentication separately. Because if you just move your plugins over, you're only moving over the plugins. You're not moving over the licensing. And another thing you may have to do is in some cases, you may have to unlicense your plugin on the old machine because sometimes the license is associated with the computer, not necessarily the plugin, you know what I mean? Not necessarily your OS or, you know what I mean? So it's still licensed to your MacBook Pro, even though you bought a new iMac. So that's another problem to deal with. Customized presets like channel strip settings, that's actually quite easy, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So from your desktop, just go to your hard drive here, and then go to users, go to your username. So mine's Carney Media Group here. Open that up. At least for Logic, you're going to go to Music, and then from Music, you're going to go to Audio Music Apps. Inside of here, you'll see all of your settings for articulation settings, bookmarks, custom channel strips. So any channel strip settings that you've made will be saved in here as CST files. So if you want to store your channel strip settings, custom icons, key commands, plugin settings, you can copy this whole folder of Audio Music Apps as a backup on a thumb drive or a backup drive. When you get to your new machine, just drag this folder, all these folders here, into the Audio Music Apps folder, and it'll just move all of those settings over, and you'll be able to access them on your new computer. So that's how you can handle channel strip settings and plugin settings. And the very last question from Musique de Rêve: how do you tune drums to this key of a song in Logic Pro? Thank you. I don't. I don't tune my drums to the key of a song because most drums inherently don't have a set pitch, right? You have the consonant or the transient information, the non-tonal information. That's like the percussiveness of the drum. You do have the body of the drum, which is your more consonant like sound of the drum, which has maybe a definite tone to it. But with drums, the pitch isn't always the same, like playing a note on a bass or a guitar. It's, the pitch wavers a little bit. There are situations with like kick drum where maybe you want the kick to be tuned to the key of your song, but you have to know a couple things. You have to know, one, what is the key of your song? Let's say I'm in A minor, for example. You would probably want the kick to be tuned to the key of A minor if the kick actually has like a set tone to it, or you know what I mean, like a set tuning to it, which many of them don't. Okay, so if I was using something like drum synth, for example, and I wanted the kick drum to match the key of the song, you have to first determine what that fundamental tone of the kick is. Like this particular kick does have like a low bass tone to it. But with drum synth, like you can play anywhere on the keyboard and the pitch will go up or down. So the key that you play actually matches the note, I think. So if I play C, the kick has actually got a low bass tone of C. You can hear the pitch kind of wavers a little bit. It doesn't just stay static. If you're gonna match the tone of a drum to the song, you're gonna have a sample first that has a tone to it, and then you're gonna have to figure out what that note is, and then you're gonna have to transpose that note up or down to match the key of the song. So if I have a sample that's on C, but I have a song that's in the key of A minor, I'm gonna have to transpose it down 3 half steps, C, B, B flat, A, to get down to the correct key. Or if I have a sample that's on G, but the song's in A, I'm gonna have to transpose it up 2 semitones to go, G, G sharp, A, to move it up the keyboard, to move the pitch up. So you just have to know those two things. What's the pitch of the sample? What's the key of the song? And then it's just a simple pitch adjustment either in Drum Machine Designer, or if you're using like a quick sampler, you can make the pitch adjustment here. And as I was pointing out earlier, yeah, it does look like this sample technically has a root key of G sharp, but sometimes in the sampler, the root key of the sample doesn't always match the note that it's mapped to. If this is truly a G sharp sample, in order to go from G sharp to say A, I would just need to transpose this up 1 half step. And that's going to give me the note A. But again, in this context, the pitch is not really noticeable with this particular drum, so there's not really a need to match the pitch, if you know what I mean. Like typically when it comes to tuning drums, I'll just listen to how the beat sounds with the rest of the arrangement, and if I feel like the kick needs to be a little looser, a little more boomier, I'll drop the pitch, and if it needs to be tighter, I'll maybe raise the pitch a little bit. But it's something that's just done arbitrarily by listening to the rest of the musical arrangement, not necessarily matching the key of the song. Now, if you're willing to sort of invest in some third-party instruments, like especially if you're trying to tune the kick to the track, I find Kick 2 is one of the best kick drum instruments out there. I use it all the time. And what it does show you is it shows you the pitch curve of the sample, or of the sound, of the modulation, I guess, of the sound. And, you can see that this kind of rests on G sharp 1, but then by the tail end of the sample, it's on G1. So if you really wanted to tune the sample to the key of the song, you could set the resting pitch to G sharp, right? So that's G sharp. Let's say I'm in the key of A. I need to go up 1 half step. Well, then I could just change the pitch here to A and make sure that it sort of rests, sustains on A. Matches. There's not really like a trick to doing this. You just have to know what the key of the song is, what the key of the sample is, shift the tuning of the oscillator, of the pitch component in the instrument or of the sample to match the key up or down, depending on how many semitones you need to go up or down. Or you may need to just determine whether you need to do that at all, whether you need to do it more arbitrarily, like I was saying before. Does the kick need to be tighter? Does the kick need to be looser and more boomy? And just try to match the texture, timbre of the kick to the texture of the song and what seems to fit the song best. But generally speaking, I am not tuning drums to fit the key of a song. Like, I almost never do that. All right, guys, so that wraps up my 300,000 subscriber Q&A special. I have no clue how long this video is going to be when I edit it, because I think I recorded about 4 hours worth of footage. Hopefully this is what you were expecting. Hopefully I was able to answer all of these questions to the best of my ability. Once again, thank you so much for the continued love and support over the last 11 years. I want to keep this channel going for another 11 years. I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. So once again, thank you for the support, and thanks for watching.